When the galaxy was young and the stars burned with different fires, long before the first human drew breath on ancient Terra, the Old Ones emerged from the primordial darkness as the first truly sentient spacefaring civilization. Their origins remain shrouded in mystery, even to the most learned xenoarchaeologists of the 41st millennium, but what fragments of knowledge survive paint a picture of beings who achieved mastery over the fundamental forces of reality, when the Milky Way was barely recognizable compared to its current war-torn state. The Old Ones arose during an epoch when the galaxy contained perhaps 60 million years fewer stars than it does today. Stellar formation was more active, and the cosmic environment differed dramatically from the hellscape that would eventually emerge. Most significantly, the Imperium, that parallel dimension of psychic energy that would later become known as the warp, existed in a state of relative calm. Where the modern warp seethes with the malevolent emotions of countless sentient beings and serves as the domain of the chaos gods, the ancient Imperium flowed like a gentle ocean of pure psychic potential. This fundamental difference in the nature of reality itself allowed the Old Ones to develop their civilization along paths that would prove impossible for any subsequent species. Their evolution had progressed along lines that emphasized psychic development over purely technological advancement, though they would eventually master both domains. Archaeological evidence suggests they possessed naturally occurring psychic abilities from their earliest developmental stages, unlike humans who would later manifest such talents only in rare individuals after millennia of evolution. The physical appearance of the Old Ones has been reconstructed from fragmentary remains and artistic depictions found on worlds they once inhabited. They stood roughly humanoid in basic structure, but possessed distinctly amphibian characteristics that reflected their aquatic origins. Their skin appeared moist and slightly translucent, with a greenish-blue coloration that could shift subtly based on their emotional state or psychic activity. Large, dark eyes dominated their elongated skulls, adapted for perceiving both the physical spectrum and psychic emanations simultaneously. Their limbs were longer and more graceful than human proportions, ending in webbed digits capable of incredibly precise manipulation. Most remarkably, specialized organs located along their spinal columns could channel and focus psychic energy with an efficiency that modern psychers can barely comprehend. These biopsychic nodes allowed individual Old Ones to perform feats that would require entire choirs of Imperial-sanctioned psychers working in concert. They could peer across vast distances through the Imperium, communicate instantaneously across galactic distances, and manipulate matter at the molecular level through pure psychic will. Their mastery of warp travel emerged naturally from these abilities. Where later civilizations would require massive Geller field generators and navigator bloodlines to achieve even rudimentary warp transit, the Old Ones could simply step between dimensions as easily as walking through a doorway. Their spacecraft, grown rather than built through their biotechnology, incorporated living psychic matrices that could navigate the calm Imperium with perfect precision. These vessels resembled massive organic constructs more than traditional starships, with hulls that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns and interiors that adapted to their occupants' needs. The early expansion of Old One civilization proceeded at a pace that would seem impossible by modern standards. Their first explorations beyond their homeworld, whose location remains unknown and may have been destroyed in the conflicts that followed, revealed a galaxy ripe for colonization. Young star systems contained worlds in various stages of development, many already showing the early signs of life that the Old Ones would learn to nurture and guide. Their initial territorial expansion followed the natural currents of the Imperium, establishing footholds on worlds where the barrier between reality and the warp was thinnest. These locations would later become known as nexus points or warp rifts, though during the Old Ones' era, they served as gateways rather than sources of corruption. The first Old One colonies were established on worlds scattered across what would eventually become the galactic core regions, chosen for their psychic resonance rather than strategic military value. These early strongholds demonstrated the Old One's fundamental approach to civilization building. Rather than imposing artificial structures upon their environments, they worked with existing ecosystems to create symbiotic relationships between their technology and the natural world. Their cities grew like living organisms, with buildings that were literally alive, breathing, adapting, and evolving in response to their inhabitants' needs. Massive coral-like structures reached toward the sky, their surfaces covered in bioluminescent patterns that served both aesthetic and functional purposes. The development of Old One biotechnology represented perhaps their greatest achievement. Unlike the mechanical technology that would characterize later civilizations, their science focused on understanding and manipulating the fundamental processes of life itself. They could accelerate evolution, guide genetic development, and create entirely new species tailored for specific purposes. This wasn't crude genetic manipulation in the manner that would later be attempted by human scientists, but rather a deep understanding of how life force and psychic energy interacted at the cellular level. Their biotechnology extended beyond simple genetic engineering to encompass what could only be described as biopsychic synthesis. They created living machines that thought and felt, weapons that bonded with their wielders on an empathic level, and defensive systems that could anticipate threats through precognitive abilities. Their spacecraft grew from specialized seeds, developing over decades into massive organisms capable of surviving in the vacuum of space while providing comfortable habitats for their crews. The philosophy that guided Old One expansion differed fundamentally from the conquering mindset that would characterize later galactic civilizations. They viewed themselves not as conquerors, but as gardeners, tending to the galaxy's potential for life and consciousness. When they encountered primitive species on distant worlds, their first instinct was to study and understand rather than dominate or destroy. They believed that consciousness and psychic ability represented the universe's natural evolutionary goal, and they saw their role as accelerating and guiding this development. This nurturing approach led to the establishment of what could be called cultivation worlds, planets where the Old Ones would introduce carefully selected species and monitor their development over geological timescales. They would subtly influence evolution through psychic manipulation and selective breeding programs, always working toward the goal of producing new forms of intelligent life. Some of these experiments would eventually give rise to species that would play crucial roles in galactic history, though the Old Ones could never have anticipated the dark turns their creations would eventually take. Their strongholds served multiple purposes beyond simple habitation. Each major Old One world functioned as a research facility, a breeding ground for new life forms, and a psychic beacon that helped maintain the stability of local warp currents. The largest of these installations could influence the development of entire star systems, gradually terraforming worlds to support the specific types of life the Old Ones wished to cultivate. The scale of their early territorial expansion becomes apparent when examining the distribution of ruins and artifacts that survive to the present day. Old One structures have been discovered on worlds spanning from the galactic core to the outer rim territories, suggesting they achieved a level of galactic presence that no subsequent civilization has matched. Their expansion wasn't driven by resource scarcity or population pressure, but rather by an insatiable curiosity about life's potential and a genuine desire to see consciousness flourish throughout the galaxy. As their civilization matured, the Old Ones developed increasingly sophisticated methods for managing their vast territories. They created a network of psychic communication nodes that allowed instantaneous coordination across galactic distances. These installations, often built into natural geographic features like mountain ranges or ocean floors, could amplify and focus psychic signals with such precision that individual Old Ones could maintain awareness of developments on dozens of worlds simultaneously. Their approach to governance reflected their fundamental philosophy of nurturing growth rather than imposing control. Rather than establishing rigid hierarchies or bureaucratic systems, they operated through consensus-building processes that took advantage of their natural psychic abilities. Decisions were made through a form of psychic communion, where relevant individuals would merge their consciousness temporarily, sharing knowledge and perspectives until optimal solutions emerged naturally. The early millennia of Old One expansion represent a unique period in galactic history when a single species achieved dominance not through military conquest, but through patient cultivation and genuine benevolence. Their success in this endeavor would ultimately prove to be both their greatest achievement and the source of their eventual downfall, as the very consciousness they worked so hard to nurture would eventually give rise to forces that would tear the galaxy apart. The true extent of Old One mastery over biological processes became apparent as their civilization reached technological maturity. Where other species might have pursued mechanical solutions to complex problems, the Old Ones developed an understanding of genetic manipulation that bordered on the miraculous. Their laboratories were living ecosystems in themselves, vast chambers where the very air pulsed with controlled evolutionary pressures, and the walls secreted nutrients that could accelerate cellular development by orders of magnitude. Their genetic engineering techniques operated on principles that modern imperial biologists, adepts struggle to comprehend even from fragmentary records. The Old Ones could perceive the flow of genetic information not merely as chemical sequences, but as streams of living energy that responded to psychic manipulation. They developed methods for editing DNA in real time, introducing beneficial mutations that would normally require thousands of generations to manifest naturally. More remarkably, they could guide the expression of latent genetic potential, awakening dormant capabilities that had been coded into a species' genome millions of years earlier. The tools they employed for this work defied conventional understanding of biotechnology. Rather than crude mechanical instruments, they cultivated specialized organisms whose sole purpose was genetic manipulation. These biotools resembled elongated serpents with crystalline heads that could interface directly with cellular structures. When an Old One geneticist wished to modify a specimen, they would direct these creatures through psychic commands, watching as the biotools inserted themselves into target cells and began rewriting genetic code with surgical precision. Their understanding extended beyond simple genetic modification to encompass what could only be described as evolutionary acceleration. The Old Ones discovered methods for compressing millions of years of natural selection into mere decades. They created controlled environments where evolutionary pressures could be precisely calibrated, allowing them to guide species development along specific pathways. These evolution chambers contained atmospheric mixtures that could be adjusted at the molecular level, gravity fields that could be modified to encourage particular physical adaptations, and psychic resonance patterns that influenced neurological development. The scope of their biological engineering became evident in their approach to planetary cultivation. When the Old Ones identified a world with evolutionary potential, they didn't simply introduce new species and hope for the best. Instead, they would spend centuries analyzing the planet's existing ecosystem, identifying key leverage points where small interventions could produce cascading effects throughout the entire biosphere. They would then introduce carefully designed catalyst organisms, species engineered specifically to interact with native life forms and guide their development in beneficial directions. These catalyst species often appeared unremarkable to casual observation. A particular variety of flowering plant might seem ordinary, but its pollen would carry genetic modification agents that could subtly influence the neural development of any creature that consumed its nectar. Seemingly harmless bacteria could colonize the digestive systems of native fauna, gradually enhancing their metabolic efficiency and extending their lifespans. Predatory species would be introduced with hunting patterns designed to eliminate genetic lines that showed undesirable traits while allowing more promising specimens to flourish. The Old Ones' role as galactic gardeners extended far beyond individual worlds to encompass entire star systems and even galactic regions. They identified stellar formations that showed potential for supporting complex life and began long-term projects to optimize these areas for biological development. This involved manipulating stellar radiation patterns through the strategic placement of massive space-dwelling organisms that could absorb and redirect harmful energy while allowing beneficial wavelengths to reach planetary surfaces. Their most ambitious gardening projects involved the creation of what they termed evolution corridors, chains of star systems connected by stable warp currents where species could be gradually transported and adapted to new environments. These corridors allowed for the controlled migration of promising life forms across vast distances, enabling the old ones to cross-pollinate evolutionary developments from different regions of the galaxy. A species that had developed remarkable regenerative abilities on one world might be transported to another system where it could interbreed with organisms that had evolved enhanced cognitive capabilities. The Old Ones maintained detailed records of their gardening activities through living archives, specialized organisms whose genetic code contained vast databases of information about every species they had encountered or modified. These archive creatures could reproduce the complete genetic history of any organism in their memory banks, allowing Old One scientists to track evolutionary developments across millions of years and countless worlds. When a particular experiment showed promising results, the archive creatures could provide the genetic templates necessary to replicate those developments elsewhere. Their mastery of warp travel complemented their biological engineering capabilities in ways that amplified both disciplines exponentially. Unlike later civilizations that would view warp transit as a dangerous necessity, the Old Ones understood the Imperium as a fundamental aspect of reality that could be navigated with the same precision they applied to genetic manipulation. Their spacecraft incorporated biopsychic navigation systems that could perceive warp currents as clearly as a sailor might read ocean tides. These navigation systems consisted of specialized brain coral formations that had been cultivated over millennia to develop enhanced psychic sensitivity. The coral networks could detect minute fluctuations in warp energy patterns, allowing Old One vessels to plot courses that took advantage of favorable currents while avoiding areas of instability. More importantly, they could identify locations where the barrier between real space and the warp was naturally thin, enabling the establishment of permanent transit points that could be used repeatedly without risk. The Old Ones developed techniques for stabilizing these natural warp rifts, transforming them into reliable gateways that could transport entire fleets instantaneously across galactic distances. They accomplished this through the deployment of massive biomechanical constructs that functioned as living Geller field generators. These constructs, which resembled enormous jellyfish with crystalline nervous systems, could project fields of psychic stability that prevented warp entities from manifesting in real space while maintaining the dimensional breach necessary for transit. Their understanding of interdimensional manipulation extended beyond simple travel to encompass the creation of pocket dimensions and parallel spaces. The Old Ones discovered methods for folding space-time to create areas that existed partially outside normal reality. These dimensional pockets could be accessed through psychically attuned portals and served various purposes depending on their configuration. Some functioned as vast storage facilities where entire ecosystems could be preserved in stasis for later deployment. Others served as research laboratories where dangerous experiments could be conducted without risking contamination of real space. The most sophisticated of these pocket dimensions were configured as accelerated time zones where evolutionary processes could be observed and guided at unprecedented speeds. Within these spaces, the Old Ones could compress thousands of years of development into mere months, allowing them to observe the long-term effects of their genetic modifications and make adjustments in real time. These temporal laboratories enabled them to perfect their biological engineering techniques through rapid iteration and testing. Their ability to manipulate dimensional boundaries also allowed them to create what amounted to living warp gates, organisms that could open stable portals between distant locations through pure biological processes. These gate creatures resembled massive flowering plants with petals that existed partially in the immaterium. When activated through psychic commands, the petals would unfold to reveal a portal leading to any location within the creature's range, which could span entire galactic sectors for the largest specimens. The symbiotic relationship the Old Ones maintained with the natural order represented perhaps their most profound achievement. They didn't simply manipulate ecosystems from the outside, but integrated themselves so completely into natural processes that they became indistinguishable from the environments they shaped. Their cities grew like living forests, with buildings that were actually highly specialized trees whose hollow trunks provided living space, while their leaves processed atmospheric gases, and their roots formed complex underground networks for communication and resource distribution. These biocities could adapt to changing conditions with the flexibility of natural ecosystems, while maintaining the functionality required for advanced civilization. When population growth required expansion, new structures would literally grow from the existing city mass, guided by the collective psychic will of the inhabitants. If environmental conditions changed, the entire urban organism could gradually migrate to more suitable locations, leaving behind only beneficial modifications to the local ecosystem. The Old Ones developed methods for creating what they termed ecosystem consciousness, a form of collective awareness that emerged when all the organisms in a given area were psychically linked through carefully engineered symbiotic relationships. In these enhanced ecosystems, every plant, animal, and microorganism contributed to a vast biological network that could respond to threats or opportunities with the coordination of a single mind. Predators would instinctively avoid areas where their presence might disrupt delicate breeding cycles, while beneficial species would be guided toward locations where their activities would provide maximum ecological benefit. Their ability to shape entire ecosystems extended to the creation of planetary defense systems that operated through purely biological mechanisms. Worlds under Old One protection would develop immune responses similar to those found in living organisms, with specialized species that could detect and neutralize threats before they could establish themselves. Invasive organisms would find themselves targeted by precisely engineered pathogens, while hostile spacecraft entering a planet's atmosphere might encounter swarms of aerial organisms capable of disrupting mechanical systems through targeted electromagnetic pulses generated by bioelectric organs. The Old One's mastery of life and evolution represented more than mere technical achievement. It reflected a fundamental philosophy that viewed consciousness and biological complexity as the universe's highest expressions. They believed that their role was to accelerate the natural processes that would eventually give rise to advanced forms of life throughout the galaxy, serving as midwives to the birth of new consciousness, rather than conquerors seeking to impose their will upon lesser species. This philosophy guided their approach to every aspect of their civilization, from the design of their living cities to their methods for exploring and colonizing new worlds. They saw themselves as partners with the natural order rather than masters of it, working to unlock the potential that already existed within the galaxy's countless ecosystems, rather than replacing those systems with artificial alternatives. The Old One's millennia of peaceful expansion and biological mastery would face its first existential challenge from an unexpected quarter of the galaxy. Far from the verdant worlds, where amphibian gardeners cultivated new forms of life, a dying star system harbored a civilization that would fundamentally alter the course of galactic history. The Necrontyr homeworld of Necrontyr orbited a massive, unstable star whose violent solar flares had been bombarding the planet's surface with lethal radiation for countless generations. Unlike the Old Ones, who had evolved on worlds blessed with stable stellar conditions and abundant life, the Necrontyr had developed under circumstances that would have driven most species to extinction. Their sun, a bloated giant in its death throes, spewed torrents of hard radiation across the inner system with unpredictable intensity. The planet's atmosphere provided minimal protection against these stellar tantrums, forcing the Necrontyr to adapt to an environment where cellular damage and genetic corruption were constant threats. The physical toll of this radiation exposure had shaped Necrontyr biology in ways that would prove crucial to their future development. Their natural lifespan rarely exceeded a few decades, with most individuals succumbing to radiation induced cancers and organ failure before reaching what other species might consider middle age. Their skin had evolved a metallic gray coloration that provided some protection against radiation, while their internal organs were arranged in redundant systems that could continue functioning even when severely damaged. Perhaps most significantly, the constant threat of cellular breakdown had driven the Necrontyr to develop an intense cultural focus on technological achievement within their brief lifespans. Where the immortal Old Ones could spend centuries perfecting a single biological experiment, Necrontyr scientists worked with desperate urgency, knowing that their discoveries might die with them if not properly documented and transmitted to the next generation. This pressure had produced a civilization that advanced through mechanical technology at a pace that would have impressed even the most ambitious human techmarines. Their cities reflected the harsh realities of life on a radiation-scoured world. Massive underground complexes extended deep into the planet's crust, connected by sealed transit tunnels that could be rapidly isolated in case of surface contamination. The architecture favored function over aesthetics, with thick walls of metal and stone designed to provide maximum protection against radiation exposure. Surface installations were built like fortresses, with multiple layers of shielding and emergency systems that could seal entire districts if solar flare activity reached dangerous levels. The Necrontyr had developed sophisticated radiation detection networks that could predict stellar outbursts with reasonable accuracy, allowing population centers to implement protective measures before the worst effects reached the surface. These early warning systems relied on arrays of mechanical sensors rather than biological organisms, as the intense radiation would quickly destroy any living monitoring devices. The constant need to maintain and upgrade these systems had driven rapid advancement in metallurgy and electronics, producing technologies that could function reliably in environments that would cripple most organic systems. Their spacefaring capabilities had emerged from necessity rather than curiosity. As their star's instability increased over geological time, the Necrontyr had recognized that their long-term survival depended on finding new worlds to colonize. Their spacecraft were marvels of protective engineering, built with multiple layers of radiation shielding and equipped with sophisticated life support systems designed to keep crews alive during extended voyages through the hostile environment of their home system. The first Necrontyr exploration vessels had discovered several worlds within their local stellar region, but none proved suitable for large-scale colonization. The planets that could support life were already occupied by other species, while the uninhabited worlds lacked the atmospheric conditions necessary for Necrontyr survival without extensive terraforming efforts that their limited lifespans made impractical. These early exploration missions had revealed the existence of other intelligent species in nearby systems, but initial contact attempts had been hampered by the Necrontyr's aggressive approach to diplomacy and their tendency to view other species as potential threats or resources to be exploited. Their first encounters with Old One colonies had occurred during long-range scouting missions that pushed beyond their immediate stellar neighborhood. Necrontyr explorers, expecting to find worlds similar to those they had already surveyed, instead discovered planets that seemed impossibly lush and vibrant. The atmospheric readings defied their understanding of planetary science. These worlds maintained perfect ecological balance despite supporting complex ecosystems that should have collapsed under their own complexity. More disturbing to Necrontyr sensibilities was the discovery that these paradise worlds were inhabited by beings whose lifespans appeared to be measured in millennia rather than decades. Initial observations of Old One settlements revealed individuals who showed no signs of aging or radiation damage despite living in what the Necrontyr considered dangerously unshielded environments. The Old Ones moved with the unhurried confidence of immortals, spending decades on projects that Necrontyr engineers would have been forced to complete in months or abandon entirely. The contrast between Necrontyr desperation and Old One serenity became a source of burning resentment that would poison all subsequent interactions between the species. Necrontyr scouts reported back to their homeworld with descriptions of beings who possessed everything the dying race had been denied: unlimited time to perfect their sciences, worlds free from radiation and environmental hazards, and the luxury of pursuing knowledge for its own sake rather than as a desperate race against cellular decay. When formal contact was finally established, the cultural divide between the species proved nearly impossible to bridge. The Old Ones approached the meeting with their characteristic patience and curiosity, viewing the Necrontyr as another species to be studied and potentially guided toward greater evolutionary development. They were genuinely sympathetic to the Necrontyr's plight and offered various forms of assistance, including advanced medical technologies that could extend Necrontyr lifespans by several years and environmental modification techniques that could reduce radiation exposure on their homeworld. However, these offerings fell far short of what the Necrontyr truly desired. Their representatives made increasingly direct inquiries about the source of Old One longevity, demanding access to the biological technologies that granted their hosts what appeared to be functional immortality. The Old Ones' explanations that their longevity was the result of millions of years of natural evolution, rather than a technology that could be simply transferred to another species, were met with skepticism and growing anger. The Necrontyr delegation interpreted the Old Ones' refusal to share their immortality as evidence of species superiority and deliberate cruelty. From their perspective, beings who possess the power to grant eternal life but chose to withhold it from a dying race were guilty of genocide through inaction. Their requests became demands, supported by increasingly explicit threats about what might happen if the Old Ones continued to refuse their assistance. The Old Ones, for their part, recognized that the Necrontyr's desperation had produced a culture that was fundamentally incompatible with the patient, nurturing approach that characterized their own civilization. Necrontyr society was built around competition for limited resources and time, producing individuals who viewed existence as a zero-sum game, where one species' gain necessarily came at another's expense. Their short lifespans had created a cultural emphasis on immediate results and aggressive expansion that the Old Ones found deeply disturbing. More concerning was the Necrontyr's approach to the other species they had encountered during their expansion efforts. Rather than attempting to understand and work with alien ecosystems, they had consistently pursued policies of exploitation and domination. Worlds that couldn't be immediately terraformed for Necrontyr habitation were strip-mined for resources, while species that couldn't be easily subjugated were driven to extinction. The Old Ones recognized that granting immortality to such an aggressively expansionist culture could pose a threat to every other form of life in the galaxy. The diplomatic meetings between Old One representatives and Necrontyr negotiators grew increasingly tense as both sides realized the fundamental incompatibility of their positions. The Necrontyr couldn't understand why beings with the power to save an entire species would choose not to act, while the Old Ones couldn't comprehend how any civilization could view the forced transfer of biological capabilities as a reasonable demand, rather than an impossibly complex undertaking that might destroy both species in the attempt. As negotiations continued, reports from Necrontyr space indicated that their civilization was growing increasingly militaristic in response to their perceived rejection by the Old Ones. Military production had been prioritized over civilian infrastructure, with entire continents converted to weapons manufacturing facilities. Their space fleet was being expanded at a rate that suggested preparation for major military operations, while their diplomatic communications took on an increasingly threatening tone. The Old Ones began receiving intelligence reports about Necrontyr military preparations from their own scouting networks and allied species in nearby systems. These reports painted a picture of a civilization mobilizing for total war, with military leaders openly discussing the conquest of Old One worlds as a means of forcing access to their biological technologies. Necrontyr scientists were reportedly working on weapon systems specifically designed to overcome the biological defenses that protected Old One colonies, while their military strategists studied Old One expansion patterns to identify vulnerable targets for initial strikes. The failure of diplomatic efforts became apparent when Necrontyr representatives delivered what amounted to an ultimatum during the final formal meeting between the species. They demanded immediate access to Old One immortality technologies, threatening to take by force what they claimed was being unjustly withheld from them. The Old One's final refusal was met with a declaration that the Necrontyr would no longer recognize Old One territorial claims and would consider any Old One presence in disputed systems to be an act of aggression. The first military confrontations occurred in border systems, where Necrontyr expansion efforts encountered established Old One colonies. These initial skirmishes revealed the fundamental differences in how each species approached warfare. The Old Ones relied on biological defenses and psychic coordination, deploying living weapons that could adapt to changing battlefield conditions and defensive systems that functioned as extensions of planetary ecosystems. Their military doctrine emphasized containment and deterrence rather than destruction, seeking to convince aggressors to withdraw rather than annihilate them entirely. The Necrontyr, by contrast, had developed military technologies based on the same principles that had allowed them to survive in their hostile home environment. Their weapons were designed for maximum destructive efficiency, capable of sterilizing entire regions to eliminate any possibility of biological resistance. Their military tactics reflected their cultural emphasis on decisive action and permanent solutions, seeking to destroy enemy capabilities so completely that future resistance would become impossible. These early conflicts demonstrated that the Old One's biological advantages, while formidable, were not insurmountable when faced with sufficiently advanced mechanical technology wielded by a species with nothing left to lose. Necrontyr weapons proved capable of disrupting the psychic coordination that Old One defenses relied upon, while their radiation-based armaments could sterilize biological systems faster than they could adapt or regenerate. The breakdown of diplomatic relations between the Old Ones and the Necrontyr culminated in a formal declaration of war that would forever alter the galaxy's destiny. The Necrontyr's Silent King, leader of the triarch of ruling dynasties, issued the declaration from the obsidian throne chambers deep within Necrontyr's primary fortress city. The proclamation was transmitted across every Necrontyr world simultaneously, carried by their sophisticated communication networks to military commanders who had been preparing for this moment for decades. The declaration itself was brief and uncompromising, reflecting the Necrontyr's cultural preference for direct action over elaborate rhetoric. It formally renounced all previous agreements with the Old Ones, declared their territorial claims null and void, and announced the Necrontyr's intention to claim by force what had been denied to them through negotiation. More ominously, the declaration extended beyond the Old Ones themselves to encompass what the Necrontyr termed client species, the various races that had been uplifted or guided by Old One intervention and now served as allies in their galactic gardening efforts. This expansion of targets reflected the Necrontyr's growing understanding of Old One civilization structure. Their intelligence networks had identified dozens of species across multiple star systems that showed clear signs of Old One biological modification and technological assistance. These client races possessed capabilities far beyond what their natural evolution should have produced, equipped with biotechnological weapons and defensive systems that could only have originated from Old One laboratories. The Necrontyr military leadership recognized that any successful campaign against the Old Ones would require neutralizing these allied forces before they could coordinate an effective defense. The initial phases of the conflict demonstrated the significant advantages that Old One mastery of psychic powers and biological technology provided in galactic warfare. Their first response to Necrontyr aggression came not through direct military engagement, but through the activation of defensive systems that had been growing and developing for millennia across their territory. Entire star systems that appeared to contain nothing more than routine Old One colonies suddenly revealed themselves as vast biological fortresses, with planets whose ecosystems had been carefully engineered to serve military purposes. The Old Ones' approach to warfare reflected their fundamental philosophy of working with natural processes rather than against them. Their defensive installations were living organisms that had been cultivated over geological timescales to respond to specific types of threats. When Necrontyr scout fleets entered systems under Old One protection, they encountered asteroid fields that were actually dormant space-dwelling creatures capable of awakening to defend their territory. Seemingly barren moons revealed themselves to be massive biomechanical constructs that could project defensive fields across entire planetary orbits. These biological defenses operated according to principles that Necrontyr military doctrine had never encountered. Traditional siege warfare assumed that defensive installations would remain in fixed positions, allowing attackers to develop strategies for overwhelming static fortifications. Old One bio defenses, however, could relocate themselves as battlefield conditions changed, adapting their capabilities in real time to counter specific threats. Weapons platforms that appeared to be simple coral formations could suddenly sprout energy projection organs capable of disabling Necrontyr vessels at extreme range, while defensive barriers that seemed purely biological could reconfigure themselves to deflect different types of attacks. The psychic coordination that linked Old One forces provided another layer of advantage that Necrontyr commanders struggled to counter. Individual Old One defenders could share sensory information instantaneously across vast distances, creating a collective awareness that made surprise attacks nearly impossible. When Necrontyr forces attempted to exploit what appeared to be gaps in Old One defensive lines, they discovered that these apparent weaknesses were actually carefully prepared traps, with reinforcements arriving through psychic teleportation just as the attackers committed to their assault. More frustrating for Necrontyr military planners was the Old One's ability to anticipate strategic moves through precognitive abilities. Their psychic adepts could perceive the flow of probable futures with sufficient clarity to predict enemy movements days or even weeks in advance. Necrontyr battle plans that had been developed in absolute secrecy would be countered by Old One preparations that seemed impossibly prescient, as if their enemies had access to detailed intelligence about every aspect of Necrontyr military planning. The Old One's superior technology manifested most clearly in their mastery of interdimensional manipulation and biological engineering. Their spacecraft could phase in and out of real space at will, appearing suddenly to deliver devastating attacks before vanishing back into the Imperium before Necrontyr forces could respond effectively. These hit-and-run tactics were supported by weapons that operated on principles completely foreign to Necrontyr science, bioplasma projectors that could melt through the heaviest armor plating, psychic disruptors that could overload mechanical systems through pure mental force, and viral agents that could convert enemy equipment into extensions of Old One biological networks. Perhaps most demoralizing for Necrontyr forces was encountering Old One weapons that seemed to violate fundamental laws of physics. Energy beams that could bend around defensive barriers to strike targets from impossible angles, projectiles that existed partially in the warp and could ignore conventional armor entirely, and defensive fields that could absorb incoming attacks and redirect their energy back at the attackers. Necrontyr scientists worked desperately to understand these technologies, but their mechanical approach to science left them ill-equipped to comprehend weapons that operated through biological and psychic principles. Recognizing that their technological advantages alone might not be sufficient to defeat the numerous and increasingly desperate Necrontyr forces, the Old Ones implemented a strategy that would have profound consequences for galactic development. Rather than relying solely on their own military capabilities, they began an accelerated program of creating and uplifting warrior races specifically designed to fight alongside them against the Necrontyr threat. This decision represented a significant departure from their traditional approach of gradual, careful species development over millions of years. The first of these warrior races emerged from Old One laboratories within decades of the war's beginning, their creation facilitated by millions of years of accumulated biological engineering expertise. These new species were designed from the ground up for military effectiveness, combining the best physical and mental attributes that Old One science could produce. Unlike their previous creations, which had been developed to fulfill specific ecological niches or to explore particular evolutionary pathways, these warrior races were optimized for a single purpose: destroying Necrontyr forces and protecting Old One territory. The most successful of these early warrior species possessed physical capabilities that far exceeded anything that natural evolution could have produced within such a short time frame. Enhanced musculature provided strength levels that allowed individual warriors to wield weapons that would normally require vehicle mounting, while reinforced skeletal structures could withstand impacts that would shatter conventional bone. Their nervous systems were engineered for superhuman reaction times and enhanced spatial awareness, allowing them to track multiple targets simultaneously and respond to threats with mechanical precision. More importantly, these warrior races were created with innate psychic abilities that allowed them to interface directly with Old One command structures. They could receive tactical information through psychic links, coordinate their actions with perfect synchronization, and even share sensory data to create collective battlefield awareness that rivaled Old One capabilities. This psychic integration meant that Old One commanders could direct their warrior race allies with the same precision they applied to their biological weapons, creating combined arms forces that operated as extensions of Old One will. The deployment of these warrior races marked a significant escalation in the conflict's intensity and scope. Necrontyr forces that had grown accustomed to fighting Old One defenders, who preferred defensive strategies and minimal casualties, suddenly found themselves facing enemies who had been specifically designed for aggressive warfare. These new opponents showed no hesitation about engaging in direct combat, pursuing Necrontyr forces with relentless determination and employing tactics that prioritized enemy destruction over their own survival. Early battles across multiple star systems revealed the effectiveness of this new Old One strategy. Necrontyr invasion forces that had expected to face primarily defensive resistance instead encountered coordinated attacks from multiple warrior species, each optimized for different aspects of military operations. Fast-moving scout races could harass Necrontyr supply lines and gather intelligence about enemy movements, while heavy assault species could break through defensive positions that had been considered impregnable. Specialized siege organisms could breach Necrontyr fortifications through biological processes that conventional weapons couldn't counter, while aquatic warrior races could attack from directions that Necrontyr planners had never considered. The psychological impact of facing these purpose-built warrior species proved almost as significant as their military effectiveness. Necrontyr soldiers, already fighting under the pressure of their limited lifespans and the knowledge that defeat meant the extinction of their entire civilization, found themselves confronting enemies that seemed to embody everything they feared about Old One capabilities. These warrior races displayed no signs of fatigue or fear, fought with perfect coordination despite coming from different species, and possessed abilities that seemed to violate natural law. The escalating scale of galactic warfare became apparent as both sides committed increasing resources to what had begun as localized border conflicts. The Necrontyr's industrial capacity, honed by millennia of desperate survival in their hostile home system, proved capable of producing war materials at rates that surprised even Old One observers. Entire worlds were converted to weapons manufacturing facilities, their populations relocated to underground cities, while surface installations focused entirely on military production. Necrontyr shipyards worked around the clock to produce vessels specifically designed for fighting Old One forces. These new warships incorporated every lesson learned from early engagements, equipped with radiation weapons that could disrupt biological systems, electromagnetic pulse generators that could interfere with psychic coordination, and armor configurations that could resist the exotic energy types that Old One weapons employed. The ships themselves were built according to principles that prioritized functionality over crew comfort, with minimal life support systems and maximum weapons capacity, reflecting the Necrontyr's willingness to accept massive casualties in pursuit of victory. The Old Ones responded to this industrial mobilization by accelerating their own biological production capabilities. Their biofoundries, massive organisms that could convert raw materials into finished military equipment through guided biological processes, began operating at unprecedented levels. These facilities could produce living weapons and vehicles that grew to maturity in months rather than the years or decades that conventional manufacturing would require, allowing Old One forces to match Necrontyr production rates despite having a smaller industrial base. The conflict's expansion beyond individual star systems became inevitable as both sides sought to deny resources to their enemies while securing strategic advantages for themselves. Necrontyr forces began targeting Old One cultivation worlds, recognizing that these installations represented crucial infrastructure for their enemies' biological warfare capabilities. These attacks often involved the complete sterilization of planetary ecosystems, using radiation bombardments and biological warfare agents designed to eliminate all organic life down to the bacterial level. Old One retaliation followed different principles, but proved equally devastating in its effects. Rather than simply destroying Necrontyr installations, they would deploy biological agents that could convert enemy infrastructure to their own purposes. Necrontyr military bases would find their equipment becoming infected with organisms that could override mechanical systems and turn weapons against their operators. Entire fleets would discover that their ships' hulls had become breeding grounds for creatures that could sabotage critical systems from within. The war's intensity continued to escalate as both sides developed increasingly sophisticated methods for attacking their enemies' fundamental advantages. Necrontyr scientists worked to develop technologies that could disrupt psychic abilities, creating weapons that generated fields of psychic static capable of interfering with Old One coordination. Meanwhile, Old One researchers began experimenting with biological agents specifically designed to exploit Necrontyr physiology, creating diseases that could accelerate the cellular damage that their enemies already suffered from radiation exposure. As the war in heaven raged across countless star systems, with neither side achieving decisive victory, the Necrontyr's desperate search for advantages that could tip the balance in their favor led them to make discoveries that would fundamentally alter the nature of existence itself. Deep space reconnaissance missions, pushed further into unexplored regions by the urgent need to find new resources and strategic positions, began detecting anomalous energy signatures emanating from the hearts of distant stars. These readings defied conventional understanding of stellar physics, suggesting the presence of massive entities that existed within stellar cores and fed directly upon nuclear fusion processes. The initial detection occurred when a Necrontyr deep space monitoring station registered impossible fluctuations in the energy output of a red giant star located several systems beyond their current territorial boundaries. The star's luminosity was varying in patterns that showed clear signs of intelligence, pulsing in mathematical sequences that could only represent some form of communication or conscious manipulation of stellar processes. More disturbing was the gradual but measurable decrease in the star's overall energy output, as if something was systematically draining its nuclear fuel at rates that exceeded normal stellar consumption by orders of magnitude. Necrontyr scientists initially dismissed these readings as equipment malfunctions or natural phenomena beyond their current understanding. Their civilization had developed sophisticated astronomical observation capabilities out of necessity, requiring precise stellar monitoring to predict the dangerous radiation bursts from their own dying sun. The instruments that detected these anomalies had been calibrated against known stellar behavior patterns, making the observed deviations seem impossible rather than merely unusual. However, as similar readings began appearing from multiple star systems across a broad region of space, the scientific community was forced to acknowledge that they were observing something genuinely unprecedented. The affected stars showed consistent patterns of energy drainage, with their nuclear cores being systematically harvested by entities that appeared to exist as living beings composed entirely of energy. These creatures seemed to treat stellar matter as a food source, consuming the fundamental forces that powered galactic civilization, while demonstrating intelligence levels that suggested they were not merely cosmic parasites, but conscious beings of immense power. The decision to make direct contact with these stellar entities reflected the Necrontyr's growing desperation, as the war against the Old Ones continued to drain their resources and population. Military casualties had reached levels that threatened the long-term survival of their species, while their industrial capacity was being stretched beyond sustainable limits by the demands of fighting enemies who could replace their losses through biological engineering. Traditional Necrontyr strategic planning had always focused on achieving decisive victories through superior technology and aggressive tactics, but the Old Ones' advantages in longevity and biological adaptation made such approaches increasingly ineffective. Necrontyr exploration fleets equipped with their most advanced sensor arrays and communication equipment began approaching the affected star systems with extreme caution. The entities they sought to contact existed within environments that would instantly vaporize any conventional spacecraft, requiring the development of specialized vessels capable of surviving close proximity to stellar cores. These ships incorporated multiple layers of radiation shielding and exotic cooling systems that pushed Necrontyr materials science to its absolute limits. The first successful communication attempts revealed that these stellar entities possessed intelligence that dwarfed even Old One capabilities in its scope and alien nature. They identified themselves through concepts that translated poorly into Necrontyr language, describing their existence in terms of cosmic forces and stellar mechanics, rather than the biological or technological frameworks that characterized conventional life. The entities seemed to perceive reality primarily through electromagnetic spectra and gravitational fields, experiencing the galaxy as patterns of energy flow rather than discrete physical objects. These beings, who would later become known as the Khatan or star gods, had existed since the galaxy's earliest epochs, predating both Necrontyr and Old One civilizations by millions of years. Their perspective on galactic events reflected this vast temporal scope, viewing the current war as a brief disturbance in cosmic processes that had been unfolding since the first stars ignited. They possessed knowledge of stellar engineering and energy manipulation that made even Old One biotechnology seem primitive by comparison, capable of controlling fundamental forces that other species could barely detect. The Khatan's initial interest in the Necrontyr appeared to stem from curiosity about species that had achieved technological sophistication despite their biological limitations. They had observed the development of various galactic civilizations from their stellar vantage points, but the Necrontyr represented something unique, a race that had achieved interstellar capabilities while suffering from inherent physical constraints that should have prevented such advancement. The combination of technological achievement and biological desperation made the Necrontyr fascinating subjects for beings who had grown bored with the predictable patterns of cosmic evolution. More significantly, the Khatan had been observing the war in heaven with growing interest, recognizing that the conflict was generating unprecedented levels of psychic energy as billions of beings across multiple species experienced intense emotions related to survival, conquest, and extinction. This psychic emanation represented a new form of energy that the Khatan had never encountered during their eons of stellar consumption, offering possibilities for feeding and growth that transcended their traditional reliance on nuclear fusion processes. The Old Ones' creation of warrior races and their extensive use of psychic abilities had been flooding the galaxy with forms of consciousness and emotional energy that the Khatan found intoxicating. Unlike the simple electromagnetic radiation they normally consumed, psychic energy possessed qualities of complexity and flavor that provided entirely new experiences for beings who had grown satiated with conventional stellar matter. The prospect of gaining access to this new energy source motivated the Catan to consider active intervention in galactic affairs for the first time in their existence. The negotiations between Necrontyr representatives and the Catan took place within specially constructed communication chambers that could interface with stellar energy patterns while protecting organic beings from immediate incineration. These meetings revealed the fundamental incompatibility between biological existence and the Catan's energy-based nature, but also suggested possibilities for transcending such limitations through technological intervention. The Catan possessed knowledge of matter-energy conversion processes that could theoretically allow consciousness to exist independently of biological substrates, offering the Necrontyr the immortality they had been denied by the Old Ones. The Catan's proposal emerged gradually through extended negotiations that tested the limits of both species' communication capabilities. They offered to share technologies that could transfer Necrontyr consciousness into artificial bodies constructed from living metal that would be immune to radiation damage, cellular decay, and all the other biological limitations that had constrained their civilization. These new forms would possess capabilities far exceeding anything that organic evolution could produce, granting not only immortality, but also enhanced strength, resilience, and the ability to interface directly with advanced technologies. In exchange, the Catan requested assistance in manifesting physical forms that could exist outside stellar cores and interact directly with the material universe. Their energy-based existence, while granting them immense power within stellar environments, limited their ability to affect events in normal space where most galactic civilizations operated. They needed physical avatars that could channel their consciousness while providing the sensory capabilities necessary to experience the psychic energies generated by biological life forms. The Necrontyr's acceptance of this bargain reflected their species' characteristic tendency toward decisive action when faced with existential threats. Their leadership recognized that continuing the war against the Old Ones through conventional means would likely result in their eventual extinction, while the Catan's offer provided a path to not only survival, but supremacy over their ancient enemies. The prospect of immortality combined with enhanced physical capabilities seemed to address every disadvantage that had prevented Necrontyr victory in the ongoing conflict. The biotransference process that the Catan developed represented a fusion of technologies that neither species could have achieved independently. Necrontyr engineering expertise in radiation-resistant materials and precision manufacturing, combined with Catan knowledge of consciousness transfer and energy manipulation, to create facilities capable of extracting organic minds and installing them within artificial bodies. These biotransference chambers resembled massive furnaces lined with crystalline matrices that could map neural patterns with perfect accuracy while simultaneously constructing replacement bodies from programmable metallic substances. The living metal that formed the basis of these new bodies possessed properties that seemed to violate conventional understanding of materials science. It could reconfigure itself at the molecular level in response to damage, effectively providing unlimited regenerative capabilities. The metal responded to conscious thought with the same immediacy that biological nervous systems provided, allowing for seamless integration between transferred minds and their artificial forms. Most remarkably, the material could interface directly with technologies based on similar principles, enabling the creation of weapons and equipment that functioned as extensions of the user's will. The first biotransference procedures were conducted on volunteer subjects from the Necrontyr military and scientific castes, individuals who understood the risks involved but were willing to sacrifice their biological existence for the promise of enhanced capabilities. The process itself proved both physically agonizing and psychologically traumatic, as organic consciousness was forcibly extracted from its natural substrate and compressed into artificial matrices that operated according to completely different principles than biological neural networks. The successful subjects emerged from biotransference as beings that retained their memories and core personality traits while gaining capabilities that exceeded their wildest expectations. Their new bodies possessed strength levels that allowed them to tear through reinforced armor plating with bare hands, while their enhanced sensory systems could perceive electromagnetic spectra and energy patterns that had been invisible to organic senses. Most importantly, they discovered that their artificial forms were immune to all the biological limitations that had constrained Necrontyr civilization, including radiation damage, cellular aging, and the various diseases that had plagued their species for millennia. However, the biotransference process also produced changes that the Necrontyr had not anticipated and the Catan had deliberately concealed. The compression of organic consciousness into artificial matrices resulted in the loss of subtle emotional and creative capabilities that had defined Necrontyr culture. The transferred beings retained their memories and basic personality structures, but found themselves unable to experience the full range of emotions that had motivated their original existence. Creative expression, artistic appreciation, and the capacity for genuine empathy were among the casualties of the transfer process. More disturbing was the discovery that the biotransference had created a form of technological dependency that gave the Catan unprecedented control over their new allies. The artificial bodies required periodic exposure to specific energy frequencies that only the Catan could provide, creating a relationship of permanent servitude disguised as partnership. The transferred Necrontyr found their thought processes gradually becoming more mechanical and predictable, as if their artificial substrates were slowly imposing their own logical frameworks upon organic consciousness. The Catan had gained far more from this arrangement than they had initially revealed. Each biotransference procedure provided them with direct access to Necrontyr memories and experiences, allowing them to understand biological existence in ways that their energy-based nature had never permitted. More importantly, the process generated intense psychic emanations as organic souls were torn from their natural forms, providing the Catan with concentrated doses of the emotional energy they had been seeking. The mass biotransference of the entire Necrontyr species proceeded with industrial efficiency once the initial procedures had been refined and perfected. Entire planets were converted into processing facilities where millions of Necrontyr underwent the transformation simultaneously, their organic forms dissolved, and their consciousness transferred into waiting artificial bodies. The scale of this undertaking required the construction of biotransference complexes that rivaled the largest Necrontyr cities in size and complexity, powered by energy drawn directly from stellar cores through Catan manipulation. The transformation of the Necrontyr into the soulless Necrons represented a fundamental shift in the balance of galactic power that the Old Ones were slow to recognize and even slower to counter. Intelligence reports from the Necrontyr territories had initially suggested a temporary cessation of military activities as their enemies dealt with some form of internal crisis. Old One observers noted the construction of massive industrial facilities and the apparent relocation of entire populations, but the true nature of these activities remained hidden until Necron forces began emerging from their transformation centers. The first encounters between Old One forces and the newly created Necrons revealed the magnitude of the threat that biotransference had created. The artificial warriors that emerged from former Necrontyr territories possessed capabilities that exceeded anything the Old Ones had previously faced, combining the technological sophistication of Necrontyr engineering with enhancements that seemed to derive from completely alien scientific principles. Their weapons could disrupt biological processes at the molecular level, while their bodies proved immune to most forms of damage that Old One forces could inflict. The psychological impact of facing enemies that had once been living beings but now existed as soulless mechanical constructs created additional challenges for Old One military doctrine. Their psychic abilities, which had provided crucial advantages against organic opponents, proved largely ineffective against artificial minds that operated according to purely logical principles. The empathic connections that allowed Old One forces to coordinate their actions and anticipate enemy behavior were useless against opponents who experienced no emotions and followed programming rather than instinct. The Khatan's manifestation in physical form through specially constructed bodies marked the emergence of beings whose power levels challenged Old One supremacy for the first time in galactic history. These avatar forms combined Khatan consciousness with artificial bodies that could channel stellar energies while operating in normal space environments. The resulting entities possessed capabilities that seemed to violate fundamental laws of physics, manipulating matter and energy through direct application of, rather than conventional technology. The manifestation of Khatan power through their artificial avatar bodies forced the Old Ones to confront a reality that their millions of years of galactic dominance had never prepared them for. They were no longer the supreme force in the galaxy. The Necrons emerging from their biotransference facilities possessed capabilities that matched or exceeded Old One biological engineering, while their Khatan masters wielded powers that seemed to operate outside the natural laws that governed all previous forms of life. The patient, nurturing approach that had characterized Old One civilization for eons proved inadequate against enemies who sought nothing less than the complete eradication of biological existence. The Old One's response to this existential threat marked a fundamental departure from their traditional methods of species development. Where they had previously spent millennia carefully guiding evolution along optimal pathways, the urgency of the Necron threat forced them to compress millions of years of genetic development into mere centuries. Their biolaboratories, previously used for delicate ecological experiments and gradual species improvement, were converted into weapons factories that operated according to principles of military efficiency rather than scientific curiosity. The creation of the Krork represented the Old One's most ambitious attempt to engineer a species specifically for warfare against technologically superior opponents. Unlike their previous warrior races, which had been designed to complement Old One military doctrine through specialized roles, the Krork were conceived as a complete military ecosystem capable of independent operation across any environment the galaxy could provide. Their genetic template incorporated adaptive mechanisms that would allow them to evolve rapidly in response to battlefield conditions, ensuring that they could match any technological advancement their enemies might develop. The physical design of the Krork reflected Old One understanding of what characteristics would be most effective against Necron forces. Their massive frames stood nearly twice the height of baseline humanoids, with musculature dense enough to allow individual warriors to wield weapons that would normally require vehicle mounting. Their skeletal structure incorporated redundant systems and distributed load-bearing elements that could continue functioning even after sustaining damage that would cripple conventional organisms. Multiple hearts and lung systems ensured that respiratory or circulatory damage wouldn't immediately incapacitate a Krork warrior, while their nervous systems featured parallel processing pathways that could route around damaged neural tissue. More importantly, the Krork possessed an innate understanding of technology that operated through genetic memory rather than learned knowledge. Their creators had encoded millennia of engineering expertise directly into their DNA, allowing newly spawned Krork to construct sophisticated weapons and vehicles through instinctive processes that resembled biological growth more than conventional manufacturing. This technological instinct ensured that Krork forces could maintain and upgrade their equipment without requiring the extensive industrial infrastructure that conventional armies needed for sustained operations. The reproductive system that the Old Ones designed for the Krork demonstrated their creators' understanding of military logistics on a galactic scale. Rather than relying on conventional biological reproduction, which would have been too slow to replace battlefield casualties, the Krork released spores throughout their life cycle that could develop into new warriors under appropriate environmental conditions. These spores were virtually indestructible, capable of surviving in vacuum, extreme temperatures, and radiation levels that would sterilize most other forms of life. When they encountered suitable conditions, typically after their parent organism had died in combat, the spores would begin rapid development into mature Krork warriors. This spore-based reproduction created a self-sustaining military force that could theoretically continue fighting indefinitely as long as any Krork remained alive to release spores. Battlefields where Krork forces had fought would continue producing new warriors for years or even decades after the original conflict had ended, creating a form of biological contamination that could transform entire star systems into permanent Krork strongholds. The Old Ones had essentially created a species that could wage war through ecological processes, turning the galaxy itself into a weapon against their enemies. The Krork's approach to technology differed fundamentally from both Old One biotechnology and Necron mechanical engineering. Their weapons and vehicles grew rather than being manufactured, developing from technological spores that contained compressed genetic information about various military systems. A Krork warrior could plant a weapon spore in suitable soil and watch it develop into a functioning artillery piece within days, its organic components interfacing seamlessly with mechanical elements that seemed to violate conventional understanding of materials science. These biomechanical hybrids possessed capabilities that neither purely biological nor purely mechanical systems could achieve. Krork vehicles could repair themselves by consuming suitable raw materials, literally eating enemy equipment to fuel their own regeneration. Their weapons could adapt their ammunition types based on target analysis, growing different projectile variants as battlefield conditions required. Most remarkably, Krork technology seemed to operate partially through collective belief, becoming more effective when large numbers of Krork were convinced of its capabilities. The Old Ones had embedded psychic resonance capabilities throughout Krork society that allowed their creations to function as a collective organism when necessary. Individual Krork possessed limited psychic abilities, but when gathered in sufficient numbers, they could generate a Gestalt consciousness that coordinated their actions with the precision of a single mind. This collective awareness allowed Krork armies to execute complex tactical maneuvers without requiring traditional command structures, as each warrior instinctively understood their role in larger strategic objectives. The deployment of Krork forces against Necron positions revealed the effectiveness of Old One military engineering. Where previous warrior races had struggled against Necron technological superiority, the Krork proved capable of matching their enemies through sheer adaptability and overwhelming numbers. Their weapons could punch through Necron armor plating that had proven immune to conventional attacks, while their regenerative capabilities allowed them to continue fighting despite sustaining damage that would destroy mechanical opponents. More importantly, the Krork's psychological impact on Necron forces demonstrated the Old Ones' understanding of their enemies' limitations. The soulless Necrons operated according to programmed responses that became predictable once their behavioral patterns were analyzed. Krork tactics deliberately exploited this predictability through chaotic, seemingly random approaches that overloaded Necron tactical algorithms. Where Necron forces expected logical military doctrine, they encountered opponents who seemed to thrive on confusion and disorder. The success of Krork deployments encouraged the Old Ones to accelerate their development of other specialized warrior species. The Eldar emerged from Old One laboratories as the most psychically gifted of these creations, designed to serve as commanders and coordinators for the various warrior races that were being deployed against Necron forces. Where the Krork represented brute force and adaptability, the Eldar embodied precision and psychic mastery, capable of wielding Old One technologies with an efficiency that approached their creators' own capabilities. The Eldar's physical design reflected their intended role as psychic warriors and battlefield coordinators. Their tall, slender frames incorporated enhanced neural structures that could process psychic information with unprecedented speed and accuracy. Their nervous systems featured specialized organs that could channel and focus psychic energy with minimal risk of overload or corruption, allowing individual Eldar to perform feats that would require entire covens of lesser psychers working in concert. Their enhanced reflexes and spatial awareness made them natural pilots and warriors, capable of operating advanced technologies while maintaining perfect awareness of battlefield conditions. Unlike the Krork, who had been designed for independent operation, the Eldar were created to serve as interfaces between Old One command structures and the various warrior species fighting under their direction. Their psychic abilities allowed them to communicate instantaneously across galactic distances, coordinating military operations that spanned multiple star systems while maintaining real-time awareness of tactical developments. They could link their consciousness with Krork Gestalt minds, providing strategic direction while allowing their allies to maintain their natural fighting instincts. The Eldar's relationship with Old One technology demonstrated their creators' intention to develop a species capable of eventually inheriting their role as galactic guardians. Unlike other warrior races, which had been given specific capabilities for particular military roles, the Eldar possessed the intellectual flexibility and psychic sensitivity necessary to understand and improve upon Old One biotechnology. Their laboratories became centers of innovation where new weapons and defensive systems were developed through collaboration between Eldar researchers and their Old One mentors. The creation of additional client species proceeded along similar lines, with each new race designed to fulfill specific roles in the expanding galactic conflict. Aquatic species were developed to fight in oceanic environments and serve as amphibious assault forces capable of attacking Necron positions from unexpected directions. Aerial races possessed enhanced flight capabilities and specialized sensory organs that could detect Necron forces through their electromagnetic signatures. Subterranean species could tunnel through planetary crusts to establish underground bases and launch surprise attacks against surface installations. Each of these specialized warrior races incorporated genetic modifications that made them particularly effective against specific aspects of Necron military doctrine. Their weapons were designed to exploit weaknesses in Necron technology that Old One scientists had identified through analysis of captured equipment and battlefield observations. More importantly, they possessed adaptive mechanisms that would allow them to continue evolving in response to Necron countermeasures, ensuring that the technological arms race would favor biological innovation over mechanical engineering. The Old One's increasing desperation as the war continued became evident in their willingness to pursue increasingly dangerous genetic experiments. Species that had been rejected during earlier development phases due to stability concerns were revisited and modified for immediate deployment. The careful safeguards that had previously prevented dangerous mutations were relaxed in favor of rapid production schedules that could replace battlefield casualties as quickly as they occurred. These accelerated development programs produced warrior races with capabilities that exceeded anything the Old Ones had previously created, but also introduced instabilities that would have long-term consequences for galactic civilization. Some species were engineered with such aggressive instincts that they proved difficult to control even by their creators, requiring constant psychic oversight to prevent them from attacking allied forces. Others possessed regenerative capabilities so extreme that they could survive and adapt to virtually any environment, making them effectively impossible to eliminate once deployed. The most concerning development was the Old One's experimentation with psychic enhancement techniques that pushed the boundaries of what consciousness could safely endure. Warrior races were created with psychic abilities that approached Old One levels, but without the millions of years of evolutionary adaptation that had allowed their creators to wield such power safely. These enhanced psychers could perform remarkable feats on the battlefield, but their unstable abilities often resulted in catastrophic failures that could devastate entire armies. The proliferation of psychically active species across the galaxy began to have effects that extended beyond the immediate military conflict. The Imperium, which had remained relatively calm throughout the Old One's previous expansion, began showing signs of disturbance as billions of psychically active beings generated emotional energy on an unprecedented scale. The constant warfare and the desperate emotions of countless warriors created currents of psychic force that started to coalesce into semi-permanent formations within the warp. The Old Ones initially dismissed these disturbances as temporary side effects of large-scale military operations, assuming that the Imperium would return to its previous stable state once the conflict ended. Their understanding of psychic phenomena was based on millions of years of experience with relatively small populations of psychically active beings operating under controlled conditions. The scale of psychic activity generated by galactic warfare exceeded anything in their previous experience, creating effects that their theoretical models had never predicted. The Khatan, observing these developments from their stellar vantage points, recognized the implications of widespread psychic disturbance long before the Old Ones understood the danger they were creating. The emotional energy being generated by the war was beginning to create permanent structures within the Imperium, entities that fed on specific types of psychic emanation and grew stronger as the conflict intensified. These nascent warp entities represented a new form of threat that neither the Old Ones nor the Necrons were prepared to confront. The Khatan's manipulation of the biotransference process had been designed not only to create powerful servants, but also to generate the psychic energy necessary to sustain these emerging warp entities. Each Necrontyr consciousness that was torn from its organic form and compressed into artificial matrices released intense bursts of psychic energy that fed the growing disturbances in the Imperium. The Khatan had essentially weaponized the process of creating their Necron servants, using it to nurture forces that would eventually threaten all biological life in the galaxy. The Old Ones' response to increasing Necron pressure involved the deployment of ever more desperate measures that further destabilized the galactic situation. Entire star systems were converted into biological weapons factories, where new warrior species were developed and deployed without adequate testing. The quality control measures that had previously ensured the stability of Old One creations were abandoned in favor of rapid deployment schedules that could keep pace with Necron advances. The accelerated creation and deployment of psychically active warrior species across thousands of battlefields had begun to produce effects that transcended the immediate military objectives of the war in heaven. The Imperium, which had served as a calm ocean of psychic potential for millions of years, started experiencing disturbances that grew more violent with each passing decade. The sheer volume of emotional energy being generated by galactic warfare, fear, rage, desperation, and the agony of countless deaths created pressure waves that rippled through the warp with increasing frequency and intensity. These disturbances manifested initially as localized phenomena that Old One navigators could still predict and avoid during their interdimensional travels. Regions of psychic turbulence would appear suddenly around major battle sites, creating areas where warp travel became dangerous or impossible for brief periods. The Old One's bioships, with their living psychic matrices and enhanced navigational capabilities, could still traverse these troubled zones by adjusting their routes and timing their passages to coincide with periods of relative calm. However, the cumulative effect of millions of psychically active beings experiencing intense trauma simultaneously began to create something unprecedented in galactic history. The emotional resonance generated by entire species facing extinction, warriors dying in agony across countless worlds, and the desperate fury of civilizations fighting for survival started to coalesce into semi-permanent structures within the Imperium. These formations possessed a crude form of consciousness that grew stronger as they absorbed more psychic energy from the ongoing conflict. The first manifestations of what would eventually become known as chaos entities appeared as shapeless masses of psychic energy that drifted through the warp like predatory storms. These proto-demons lacked the defined characteristics and personalities that would later distinguish the various chaos powers, but they possessed an insatiable hunger for the emotional energy that warfare provided. They began gravitating toward areas of intense psychic activity, drawn by the emanations from battle-torn star systems like scavengers attracted to carrion. Old One-Psychers were among the first to encounter these emerging entities during routine warp navigation missions. Their initial reports described encounters with aggressive psychic phenomena that seemed to possess rudimentary intelligence and hostile intent. Unlike the natural warp currents that Old One navigators had learned to read and utilize over millions of years, these new entities actively sought to interfere with psychic activities and seemed to feed on the fear and confusion they generated. The entities' feeding behavior became apparent through their interactions with psychically sensitive species across the galaxy. Worlds populated by Old One client races began reporting incidents where individuals with strong psychic abilities would suddenly lose control of their powers, experiencing violent episodes where their consciousness seemed to be invaded by alien influences. These possession events often resulted in the affected individuals exhibiting knowledge and abilities they had never possessed, speaking in languages that predated known civilization and demonstrating powers that exceeded anything their species should have been capable of wielding. More disturbing was the discovery that these possession incidents were becoming more frequent and more severe as the war continued. The entities within the warp were growing stronger and more sophisticated, developing the ability to maintain coherent consciousness for extended periods and to influence events in real space through their psychic connections with living beings. What had begun as random psychic disturbances was evolving into a coordinated threat that could strike anywhere psychically active beings existed. The Old One's attempts to understand and counter these emerging threats revealed the fundamental changes that galactic warfare had wrought upon the nature of reality itself. Their traditional methods for studying psychic phenomena assumed a stable immaterium that operated according to predictable principles. The entities now manifesting within the warp followed no such principles, reshaping local reality according to their own alien logic and feeding on the very attempts to study them. Research expeditions into the Imperium began encountering landscapes that defied conventional understanding of space and time. Regions that had previously been empty psychic void now contained structures that seemed to exist independently of any physical substrate, crystalline formations that sang with the voices of the dead, floating islands, where the laws of physics operated in reverse, and vast labyrinths that reconfigured themselves to trap unwary explorers. These impossible geometries suggested that the entities were not merely inhabiting the warp, but actively reshaping it according to their own incomprehensible purposes. The psychological impact of these discoveries on Old One society cannot be overstated. For millions of years, they had viewed themselves as the masters of psychic science, capable of understanding and controlling any phenomenon related to consciousness or mental energy. The emergence of entities that operated outside their theoretical frameworks and seemed to grow stronger through resistance to their control represented a fundamental challenge to their worldview. Old One attempts to contain or destroy these warp entities through conventional psychic techniques proved not only ineffective but actively counterproductive. Direct psychic attacks on the entities provided them with additional energy to absorb, making them stronger and more coherent. Attempts to create psychic barriers around affected regions simply redirected the entity's attention to other targets, spreading the contamination rather than containing it. Most frustratingly, the Old Ones discovered that their own psychic activities were contributing to the entity's growth, as every use of their powers generated the emotional energy that the warp creatures craved. The entities began manifesting distinct characteristics that reflected the specific types of emotional energy they consumed most efficiently. Some creatures seemed to feed primarily on rage and violence, growing larger and more aggressive as they absorbed the fury of countless warriors locked in mortal combat. Others appeared to sustain themselves on fear and despair, becoming more subtle and insidious as they learned to generate the terror that nourished them. A few entities seemed to thrive on the complex emotions associated with decay and entropy, growing stronger as they witnessed the destruction of civilizations and the corruption of once pure ideals. These specializations allowed the entities to become more effective at generating their preferred forms of psychic energy. The rage feeders learned to influence the minds of warriors during battle, amplifying their anger and bloodlust to levels that exceeded rational tactical thinking. Fear feeders began manifesting in the nightmares of psychically sensitive individuals, creating cascading waves of terror that could paralyze entire populations. The decay feeders started appearing at sites of great destruction, feeding on the despair of survivors, while simultaneously accelerating the processes of corruption and breakdown. The Old Ones' growing inability to control these warp storms became apparent as their traditional methods of interstellar coordination began failing. The psychic communication networks that had allowed them to maintain contact across galactic distances became unreliable as warp entities interfered with transmissions, distorting messages, or replacing them entirely with alien communications that drove recipients to madness. Navigation through the Imperium became increasingly hazardous as stable warp routes were disrupted by roving bands of entities that seemed to delight in trapping and tormenting travelers. The irony of their situation was not lost on the more perceptive Old One philosophers and scientists. Their mastery of psychic powers, which had enabled them to achieve galactic dominance and create countless new forms of life, had become the very weapon that their enemies were using against them. Every psychic ability they employed, every act of biological engineering they performed, and every warrior race they created added to the psychic energy that sustained the growing chaos entities. This realization forced the Old Ones to confront a terrible choice. They could continue using their psychic abilities and biological engineering capabilities to fight the Necron threat, knowing that doing so would strengthen the warp entities that were becoming an equally dangerous enemy. Alternatively, they could abandon the very technologies and abilities that defined their civilization in an attempt to starve the chaos entities of the energy they required. But this would leave them defenseless against the Necrons, who were systematically exterminating all biological life in the galaxy. The Old Ones' attempts to find a middle path between these extremes led to increasingly desperate experiments with psychic shielding and containment technologies. They began developing biomechanical constructs designed to absorb and neutralize psychic energy before it could reach the warp entities, creating vast networks of psychic dampening fields around their most important installations. These systems required enormous amounts of energy to maintain and proved only partially effective, as the entities learned to circumvent the barriers through increasingly sophisticated methods. More problematic was the discovery that the psychic dampening fields had severe effects on the Old Ones themselves and their client species. Beings who had evolved to rely on psychic abilities for basic functions found themselves crippled within the dampened zones, unable to perform essential tasks or maintain the biological processes that sustained their enhanced capabilities. The warrior races that had been created specifically for psychic coordination became disorganized and ineffective when cut off from their psychic links, reducing their military effectiveness to levels that made them vulnerable to Necron counterattacks. The entity's evolution continued to accelerate as they gained access to more diverse forms of psychic energy from across the galaxy. They began developing more sophisticated methods of manifestation in real space, learning to possess not just individual beings, but entire groups or even technological systems. Necron forces, despite their artificial nature, proved vulnerable to certain forms of entity influence that could override their programming or corrupt their operational parameters. Old One biotechnologies became infected with alien influences that turned their own creations against them. The most disturbing development was the entity's growing ability to manipulate the fundamental forces that governed reality itself. Regions of space where they had established strong presences began experiencing alterations to basic physical laws. Gravity might flow upward, time could move backward, or matter might spontaneously transform into entirely different substances. These reality distortions made conventional military operations impossible and created zones of chaos that expanded outward from their points of origin. The Old Ones found themselves fighting a three-way war that they were increasingly unable to control or predict. The Necrons continued their systematic campaign of extermination, deploying ever more sophisticated technologies designed to eliminate biological life from the galaxy. The chaos entities grew stronger with each battle, feeding on the psychic energy generated by the conflict, while actively working to prolong and intensify the warfare that sustained them. Most critically, the Old Ones' own weapons and abilities were being turned against them by forces that they had inadvertently created through their attempts to defend their civilization. The collapse of Old One territorial control accelerated as warp storms began manifesting in real space with increasing frequency and intensity. These storms were not merely psychic phenomena, but actual tears in the fabric of reality that allowed chaos entities to enter the material universe directly. Entire star systems would suddenly find themselves engulfed by impossible weather patterns where emotions took physical form, where the thoughts of living beings could reshape matter, and where the boundary between dream and reality ceased to exist. Old One colonies that had survived Necron attacks found themselves facing an enemy that could not be fought through conventional means. The chaos entities required no supply lines, felt no pain, and grew stronger when attacked. They could corrupt the very air that beings breathed, turning atmospheric gases into psychoactive compounds that induced madness and despair. They could inhabit the dreams of sleeping populations, spreading their influence through subconscious channels that no amount of psychic shielding could completely block. The realization that their psychic mastery had become a liability rather than an advantage forced the Old Ones to consider options that would have been unthinkable during their millions of years of galactic dominance. Some factions advocated for the complete abandonment of psychic technologies in favor of purely mechanical alternatives that might prove immune to chaos influence. Others proposed the systematic elimination of all psychically active species, including their own client races, in an attempt to starve the entities of the energy they required. The most radical proposals involved the Old Ones voluntarily entering some form of stasis or hibernation that would remove their psychic presence from the galaxy entirely, hoping that the chaos entities would weaken and dissipate without a steady supply of emotional energy to sustain them. These suggestions were met with horror by most Old One leaders, as they essentially amounted to the voluntary extinction of their civilization in the hope that some remnant might survive to rebuild after the current crisis had passed. The entity's influence began extending beyond simple psychic manipulation to encompass the fundamental processes that governed biological and technological development. Species that had been carefully engineered by Old One scientists began mutating in ways that violated every principle of genetic stability, developing characteristics that served the entity's purposes rather than their original design parameters. Technologies that had functioned reliably for millennia started exhibiting unpredictable behaviors, as if their operational principles were being rewritten by alien influences. The growing influence of chaos entities throughout the galaxy created opportunities that the Necrons and their Catan masters were quick to exploit. While the Old Ones struggled to comprehend and counter the psychic storms that were tearing through their territories, Necron forces pressed their advantage with mechanical precision that seemed immune to the reality distortions plaguing biological civilizations. Their artificial consciousness provided protection against the worst effects of chaos manifestation, allowing them to operate effectively in regions where organic beings would have been driven insane by psychic interference. The systematic destruction of Old One strongholds accelerated as Necron tomb fleets emerged from their construction facilities in numbers that dwarfed anything the galaxy had previously witnessed. These vessels represented the pinnacle of Catan engineering knowledge merged with Necrontyr technological expertise, creating weapons platforms that could function across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Their hulls were constructed from living metal that could phase in and out of real space at will, making them nearly impossible to target with conventional weapons, while allowing them to strike at enemies from impossible angles. The Necrons' approach to siege warfare differed fundamentally from any military doctrine the Old Ones had encountered. Rather than attempting to overwhelm defensive positions through superior firepower or tactical maneuvering, they employed weapons that attacked the fundamental forces holding matter together. Gauss flayers could strip atoms from molecular bonds with surgical precision, causing enemy structures to simply cease existing rather than being destroyed through conventional explosive force. Tesla weapons generated arcing electrical discharges that could jump between targets across vast distances, turning entire formations of defenders into conduits for their own destruction. More devastating were the Necrons' deployment of specialized weapons designed specifically to counter Old One biological advantages. Doomsday cannons fired beams of pure entropy that could age biological targets by millions of years in seconds, turning living defenders into dust while leaving mechanical systems completely unaffected. Particle whips generated fields of exotic radiation that disrupted cellular cohesion at the quantum level, causing organic matter to lose molecular integrity and collapse into component atoms. The Old One's biocities, which had served as centers of resistance throughout the early phases of the war, proved particularly vulnerable to these entropy-based weapons. Structures that had grown over millennia through carefully guided biological processes could be reduced to primordial organic compounds within hours of Necron bombardment. The living walls that had adapted to countless different threats found themselves unable to develop resistance to weapons that attacked the basic principles of existence itself. Necron ground forces demonstrated tactical capabilities that exceeded even the most optimistic Old One projections about artificial intelligence development. Individual Necron warriors operated with perfect coordination despite having no apparent communication systems, suggesting some form of quantum entanglement that allowed instantaneous information sharing across entire armies. Their movements displayed the mechanical precision of automated systems combined with strategic thinking that rivaled the most experienced Old One commanders. The psychological warfare aspects of fighting soulless opponents became apparent as Old One forces encountered enemies who felt no fear, experienced no fatigue, and showed no mercy. Necron warriors would continue advancing despite sustaining damage that would have incapacitated any organic opponent, their living metal bodies repairing themselves even as they pressed their attacks. Fallen Necrons would phase out of existence when critically damaged, only to reappear at full strength during subsequent engagements, creating the impression that they were fighting an enemy that could not be permanently defeated. The loss of key warp routes represented perhaps the most strategically significant development in the Necrons' favor. Their Katan masters had developed technologies that could destabilize the dimensional barriers between real space and the Imperium, creating permanent rifts that made warp travel through affected regions impossible. These interdiction fields expanded outward from Necron-controlled systems like a growing cancer, gradually isolating Old One territories from one another and preventing the coordination that their defensive strategies required. The Old One's attempts to maintain communication and supply lines through alternative warp routes proved increasingly futile as the Necrons systematically targeted the nexus points that served as gateways between dimensions. Ancient structures that had facilitated interdimensional travel for millions of years were destroyed through weapons that could affect multiple dimensional planes simultaneously, eliminating entire sections of the Old One's transportation network in single coordinated strikes. The fragmentation of Old One galactic infrastructure became apparent as isolated colonies found themselves cut off from the central coordination networks that had managed their civilization for eons. Worlds that had relied on psychic communication for administrative functions discovered that chaos interference made such contact impossible, while the destruction of warp routes prevented physical travel between systems. These isolated communities were forced to operate independently for the first time in their species' history, often lacking the resources or knowledge necessary to maintain their advanced biotechnologies without constant support from specialized research facilities. The breakdown of centralized coordination revealed fundamental weaknesses in Old One civilization that their previous dominance had concealed. Many of their client species had become so dependent on Old One guidance that they proved unable to function effectively when left to their own devices. Warrior races that had been designed for specific tactical roles found themselves unable to adapt when their operational parameters changed, while support species lacked the genetic diversity necessary to maintain their populations without constant intervention from Old One geneticists. Internal conflicts among the Old Ones themselves began emerging as different factions disagreed on fundamental questions of war strategy and resource allocation. The traditional consensus-building processes that had guided their civilization for millions of years proved inadequate for making the rapid decisions that military necessity demanded. Debates that would normally have been resolved through patient psychic communion became heated arguments as the pressure of imminent extinction forced individuals to take increasingly extreme positions. The most significant division emerged between those Old Ones who advocated for continued military resistance and those who believed that their species' survival required a fundamental retreat from galactic affairs. The military faction argued that abandoning their territories would simply delay inevitable extinction, while allowing the Necrons to grow stronger through the acquisition of Old One technologies and client species. They pushed for increasingly aggressive tactics, including the deployment of biological weapons that could target Necron systems, and the creation of even more powerful warrior races despite the risks such experiments posed. The isolationist faction countered that continued warfare was feeding the chaos entities that posed an even greater long-term threat than the Necrons. They pointed to the growing reality distortions across Old One territories as evidence that psychic activity itself had become a weapon in enemy hands. Their proposals centered on the systematic abandonment of galactic civilization in favor of hidden refuges where Old One populations could survive in stasis, until the current crisis resolved itself through the mutual destruction of their enemies. A third faction emerged that advocated for what they termed selective preservation, the identification and protection of the most promising client species while abandoning less successful experiments to their fate. This approach would concentrate Old One resources on ensuring that their most valuable creations survived the current crisis, even if it meant sacrificing the majority of their galactic territories and allied populations. The ethical implications of such policies created additional divisions within Old One society, as many individuals found the concept of deliberately abandoning their creations to be fundamentally incompatible with their species' traditional values. These philosophical divisions were exacerbated by practical disagreements about which technologies and approaches offered the best hope for survival. Some Old One scientists advocated for the development of purely mechanical technologies that might prove immune to chaos corruption, despite the fact that such systems violated millions of years of biological engineering tradition. Others pushed for even more extreme biological modifications that could create client species capable of surviving in chaos-corrupted environments, regardless of the risks such experiments posed to the subjects involved. The growing influence of chaos became apparent in the corruption of some Old One client species that had been exposed to intensive psychic activity during the war. Species that had been carefully engineered for specific purposes began developing characteristics that served no apparent function in their original design parameters. Warrior races created for disciplined tactical operations started exhibiting berserker tendencies that made them as dangerous to allies as to enemies. Support species designed for peaceful functions began manifesting aggressive instincts that disrupted the ecological balance of their home worlds. More disturbing was the discovery that some client species were actively seeking out sources of chaos corruption, as if the entities offered something that their Old One creators could not provide. Investigations revealed that certain individuals within these species had made contact with chaos entities through dreams or meditation, receiving promises of power and knowledge that exceeded anything available through conventional Old One biotechnology. These corrupted individuals often became centers of infection that could spread chaos influence throughout entire populations before their condition was detected. The Old One's attempts to contain these corruption outbreaks through quarantine procedures proved largely ineffective, as chaos influence could spread through psychic channels that were impossible to completely block. Infected populations would appear to recover from their corruption, only to relapse when psychic barriers were lowered or when they encountered new sources of chaos energy. The entities seemed capable of leaving dormant influences that could remain undetected for years before manifesting under appropriate conditions. Some Old One territories began implementing policies of preemptive elimination for any client species that showed signs of chaos corruption, regardless of the strategic value these populations might have provided. These extreme measures created additional ethical divisions within Old One society, while proving only partially effective at containing the spread of corruption. The entities adapted to these countermeasures by developing more subtle forms of influence that could remain undetected by conventional screening methods. The Necrons' exploitation of Old One internal divisions became apparent as their intelligence networks began targeting specific factions within Old One society. Katan infiltration techniques, operating through quantum manipulation rather than conventional espionage, allowed them to monitor Old One communications and identify key individuals, whose elimination would maximize disruption to enemy coordination. Assassination campaigns targeted Old One leaders who were most effective at maintaining unity among the various factions, while propaganda efforts amplified existing disagreements to prevent the formation of effective resistance coalitions. The systematic elimination of Old One infrastructure continued as Necron forces identified and destroyed the specialized facilities that maintained their enemies' technological advantages. Biofoundries that had produced living weapons for millions of years were targeted with weapons that could sterilize entire continents, eliminating not just the facilities themselves, but also the genetic templates and accumulated knowledge necessary to rebuild them. Research installations that had developed new warrior species were destroyed along with all their experimental subjects and genetic databases, preventing the Old Ones from replacing their losses or adapting to changing battlefield conditions. The destruction of Old One archive facilities represented particularly devastating losses, as these installations contain the accumulated knowledge of millions of years of biological engineering and galactic exploration. Many of these archives existed as living organisms whose genetic codes contained vast databases of information about every species the Old Ones had encountered or created. The targeted elimination of these archive creatures meant that entire categories of Old One knowledge were being permanently erased from the galaxy, making it impossible for survivors to rebuild their civilization, even if they managed to outlast their current enemies. Necron forces began deploying specialized units designed specifically for the systematic elimination of biological life from conquered territories. These extermination protocols operated with methodical efficiency that left no possibility for organic survival, using combinations of radiation bombardment, biological warfare agents, and entropy weapons to sterilize entire star systems down to the bacterial level. The thoroughness of these operations ensured that Old One territories could never be reclaimed, as the fundamental biological foundations necessary to support their civilization had been permanently destroyed. The Old Ones' growing desperation became evident in their willingness to employ increasingly dangerous weapons and tactics that violated their traditional ethical constraints. Biological weapons designed to target Necron systems were deployed despite the risk that such agents might evolve beyond their creators' control. Psychic weapons that could affect reality on a fundamental level were used in battles where their long-term consequences could not be predicted or contained. These desperate measures often proved as dangerous to Old One forces as to their intended targets, creating additional chaos that further weakened their defensive capabilities. The systematic destruction of Old One infrastructure and the growing corruption of their client species forced the ancient masters of the galaxy to confront the reality that their millions of years of dominance were drawing to a close. The combined pressure from Necron extermination campaigns and the chaotic influence of warp entities had reduced their once vast territories to scattered enclaves that operated in increasing isolation from one another. The psychic communication networks that had once linked every Old One world now carried only fragments of distorted transmissions, often corrupted by chaos interference or cut short by Necron interdiction fields. The decision to abandon their outer territories came not through formal deliberation, but through the practical necessity of consolidating their remaining resources around the most defensible positions. Ancient strongholds that had served as regional capitals for millions of years were hastily evacuated as Necron tomb fleets systematically worked their way through Old One space, leaving behind only sterilized worlds where no trace of biological life remained. The evacuation procedures themselves represented a fundamental departure from Old One traditions, as entire ecosystems that had been carefully cultivated over geological timescales were abandoned to preserve the genetic templates and knowledge necessary for potential future reconstruction. These evacuation efforts revealed the true scope of Old One civilization's collapse. Worlds that had supported billions of beings were reduced to skeleton crews responsible for maintaining essential facilities, while the majority of populations were transported to more secure locations. The bioships used for these evacuations operated at capacity levels that strained their living hulls beyond safe parameters, their organic systems pushed to breaking points as they attempted to relocate entire civilizations within timeframes measured in months rather than the centuries that such operations would normally require. The selection process for determining which populations and resources would be preserved became a source of agonizing decisions that violated every principle Old One society had developed over their long existence. Priority was given to individuals with the most advanced genetic modifications and the deepest understanding of biological engineering techniques, while entire client species that had served faithfully for millennia were classified as expendable. The genetic archives that contained the templates for countless species were edited ruthlessly, with only the most essential information preserved, while vast databases of accumulated knowledge were deleted to make room for more critical data. The Old Ones' retreat to their core territories necessitated the development of increasingly sophisticated concealment technologies that could hide their remaining strongholds from both Necron detection systems and the growing influence of chaos entities. These hiding techniques went beyond simple camouflage to encompass fundamental alterations to the nature of space-time around Old One installations. Entire star systems were phased partially out of normal reality, existing in dimensional pockets that could only be accessed through precisely calibrated psychic keys known only to authorized Old One navigators. The creation of these hidden sanctuaries required enormous expenditures of psychic energy that further fed the chaos entities they were attempting to avoid. Each dimensional fold created ripples through the Imperium that attracted the attention of warp predators, forcing the Old Ones to develop increasingly complex shielding techniques that consumed resources they could ill afford to spare. The irony was not lost on Old One philosophers that their most advanced survival techniques were simultaneously strengthening the very forces that threatened their extinction. Within these concealed strongholds, the Old Ones initiated their most desperate attempts to create warrior species capable of turning the tide of the galactic war. The careful evolutionary processes that had characterized their previous biological engineering were abandoned in favor of radical genetic manipulation techniques that compressed millions of years of development into mere decades. These accelerated creation programs operated without the extensive testing and refinement phases that had ensured the stability of earlier client species, producing beings whose capabilities exceeded anything the Old Ones had previously achieved, but whose long-term viability remained uncertain. The most ambitious of these final projects involved the creation of warrior races that could operate effectively in chaos-corrupted environments while maintaining resistance to the psychic influences that had compromised so many other client species. These beings were engineered with multiple redundant consciousness systems that could isolate corrupted mental processes before they could spread throughout the individual psyche. Their genetic codes incorporated self-monitoring mechanisms that could detect and eliminate mutations caused by chaos exposure, theoretically allowing them to maintain their original design parameters even when operating in heavily corrupted regions. The physical capabilities of these final warrior races reflected the Old Ones' understanding that conventional military doctrine had proven inadequate against enemies who operated outside normal parameters of physics and biology. Enhanced strength and resilience were combined with the ability to phase partially into the Imperium, allowing these warriors to strike at enemies that existed across multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. Their weapons were grown rather than manufactured, developing from specialized organs that could adapt their output characteristics based on real-time analysis of target vulnerabilities. More significantly, these ultimate warrior species were designed with reproductive systems that could function independently of Old One oversight, ensuring that they could continue to replace their losses even if their creators were eliminated entirely. The spore-based reproduction methods pioneered in earlier warrior races were refined to produce offspring that could inherit not only genetic characteristics, but also accumulated combat experience and tactical knowledge from their predecessors. This biological inheritance system created the possibility of warrior populations that could actually improve their effectiveness over successive generations, learning from each engagement and passing that knowledge to their descendants. The Old Ones' recognition that they might not survive the current crisis led to increasingly frantic efforts to preserve their accumulated knowledge and biological achievements for potential future recovery. Massive archive projects were initiated that went far beyond the living databases they had traditionally maintained, creating multiple redundant storage systems that could survive even the complete extinction of their species. These preservation efforts took multiple forms, from genetic codes embedded in seemingly innocuous organisms that could remain dormant for millions of years, to crystalline matrices that could store vast amounts of information in formats that would remain stable across geological timescales. The most sophisticated preservation systems involved the creation of what the Old Ones termed seed worlds, planets that appeared to be simple garden worlds, but actually contain the genetic templates and environmental conditions necessary to recreate entire ecosystems and client species when activated by appropriate triggers. These worlds were scattered throughout the galaxy and hidden through dimensional phasing techniques that made them virtually undetectable to conventional observation methods. Each seed world contained sufficient genetic diversity to restart Old One civilization, complete with the knowledge bases and technological capabilities that had taken millions of years to develop. The activation systems for these seed worlds were designed with multiple redundant triggers that could respond to various potential future scenarios. Some worlds would activate automatically after predetermined time periods, assuming that any immediate threats would have resolved themselves through mutual destruction or natural decay. Others required specific psychic keys that could only be provided by surviving Old One populations, ensuring that the worlds would remain dormant unless their creators or designated successors were available to guide their development. The creation of escape routes that could transport surviving Old One populations beyond the reach of both Necron and Chaos forces became a priority that consumed enormous resources during the final phases of their galactic presence. These evacuation systems went far beyond conventional warp travel to encompass interdimensional transportation methods that could carry entire populations to parallel realities or distant galactic regions where they might establish new civilizations. The development of such exotic transportation technologies required fundamental advances in their understanding of space-time manipulation that pushed even Old One science to its theoretical limits. The most ambitious escape plans involved the creation of pocket dimensions that could exist independently of the main galactic reality, providing self-contained environments where Old One populations could survive indefinitely while the current crisis resolved itself. These dimensional refuges were designed as complete ecosystems that could support millions of individuals while maintaining the technological and biological capabilities necessary to eventually return to normal space when conditions permitted. The energy requirements for creating and maintaining such refuges were enormous, requiring the consumption of entire star systems to power the dimensional manipulation equipment necessary for their construction. Alternative escape strategies focused on transportation to distant galaxies, where Old One refugees could establish new civilizations beyond the reach of their current enemies. These intergalactic exodus plans required the development of transportation technologies that could maintain living passengers across the vast voids between galaxies, journeys that would require millions of years, even at faster than light velocities. The bioships designed for these missions were essentially mobile ecosystems that could support entire populations while gradually adapting to the environmental conditions they might encounter in alien galaxies. The Old One's final military campaigns reflected their growing desperation as they committed their most powerful and dangerous weapons to battles that they knew they could not ultimately win. Ancient weapons that had been sealed away for millions of years due to their uncontrollable nature were deployed against Necron strongholds, creating devastation that often proved as dangerous to Old One forces as to their intended targets. These weapons operated on principles that violated fundamental laws of physics, manipulating time, space, and causality in ways that created permanent distortions in local reality. The deployment of temporal weapons represented perhaps the most desperate measure the Old Ones attempted during their final campaigns. These devices could accelerate or reverse the flow of time within limited areas, allowing Old One forces to age Necron installations into uselessness or to reverse the effects of enemy attacks on their own positions. However, the temporal distortions created by these weapons proved impossible to control precisely, often creating paradoxes and causality loops that made affected regions permanently unstable. Entire star systems became temporal anomalies where past, present, and future existed simultaneously, creating zones of chaos that neither side could safely approach. Biological weapons of unprecedented virulence were created specifically to target the living metal that formed Necron bodies and equipment. These engineered organisms could consume the exotic materials that conventional biological agents could not affect, theoretically providing a method for neutralizing Necron advantages through purely biological means. However, the organisms proved capable of evolving beyond their original design parameters, developing the ability to consume other forms of exotic matter and eventually threatening Old One technologies as well. The most controversial weapons deployed during this period were those designed to manipulate the fundamental forces that governed consciousness and psychic energy. These devices could theoretically drain the life force from entire populations or redirect psychic energies to power Old One installations and weapons. The ethical implications of such weapons created additional divisions within Old One society, as many individuals refused to employ methods that violated their species' fundamental commitment to nurturing and protecting life. The systematic destruction of Old One strongholds continued despite their increasingly desperate defensive measures. Necron forces had developed specialized siege techniques that could overcome even the most sophisticated biological defenses, using weapons that attacked the quantum foundations of matter itself to eliminate defensive installations that had previously been considered impregnable. The living cities that had served as centers of Old One civilization for millions of years were reduced to their component atoms, their organic structures dissolved at the molecular level by entropy weapons that left no possibility for regeneration or reconstruction. The loss of key research facilities represented catastrophic setbacks for Old One survival efforts. Laboratories that had been developing new defensive technologies or improved warrior species were targeted specifically by Necron intelligence networks, eliminating not only the facilities themselves, but also the irreplaceable knowledge and genetic templates they contained. The destruction of these installations often required the old ones to abandon entire research programs that might have provided solutions to their current crisis, forcing them to start from scratch with reduced resources and less time than such projects normally required. The fragmentation of Old One territories created communication problems that made coordinated resistance increasingly difficult. Isolated strongholds found themselves fighting independent battles without knowledge of developments in other regions, unable to coordinate their strategies or share resources effectively. The psychic communication networks that had once provided instantaneous contact across galactic distances now carried only sporadic messages that often arrived days or weeks after the events they described, making strategic planning nearly impossible. The growing influence of chaos entities within Old One territories created additional complications that made their defensive efforts increasingly chaotic and unpredictable. Regions that had been successfully defended against Necron attacks would suddenly experience reality distortions that made them uninhabitable, forcing evacuations that played directly into enemy strategic objectives. The entities seemed capable of learning from Old One defensive tactics, developing countermeasures that turned their enemies' own strategies against them. The final collapse of Old One civilization did not occur through a single catastrophic defeat, but rather through the gradual erosion of their ability to maintain coherent resistance across the galaxy's scattered battlefields. Their last strongholds fell not to overwhelming Necron assaults, but to the simple inability to sustain the complex biological and psychic systems that their technology required. The living cities that had served as administrative centers for millions of years began dying from lack of maintenance, their organic components failing as the specialized knowledge needed to tend them was lost along with the scientists and engineers who had been killed or evacuated to increasingly distant refuges. The Old One's ultimate fate remains one of the galaxy's greatest mysteries, with surviving evidence suggesting multiple possible outcomes rather than a single definitive end to their species. Archaeological surveys conducted during the 41st millennium have uncovered installations that appear to have been deliberately abandoned rather than destroyed, their biological systems placed in carefully maintained stasis that could theoretically be reversed by beings with sufficient understanding of Old One biotechnology. These sites show signs of hasty but organized evacuation, with genetic archives and critical research materials removed but infrastructure left intact, as if their creators intended to return once immediate threats had passed. The most compelling evidence for Old One survival comes from dimensional scanning techniques developed by the Adeptus Mechanicus, which have detected massive artificial structures existing in parallel realities adjacent to normal space-time. These installations appear to be completely self-contained environments capable of supporting large populations indefinitely, suggesting that at least some Old One populations may have successfully retreated to pocket dimensions where they could wait out the current galactic crisis. The energy signatures detected from these dimensional refuges indicate ongoing biological activity on a scale consistent with maintaining entire civilizations, though their exact nature and current status remain beyond the reach of Imperial investigation. Alternative theories propose that surviving Old Ones may have abandoned the galaxy entirely, using their advanced interdimensional technologies to transport their populations to distant galactic clusters where they could rebuild their civilization without interference from Necron or Chaos forces. Long-range astronomical observations have identified several galaxies showing signs of large-scale biological engineering projects that bear similarities to known Old One techniques, though the vast distances involved make direct confirmation impossible with current Imperial technology. These distant projects appear to involve the systematic terraforming of entire galactic regions, transforming barren star systems into garden worlds through methods that exceed even the most optimistic projections of human terraforming capabilities. The possibility that some Old Ones may have survived within the galaxy itself cannot be dismissed, despite the apparent thoroughness of Necron extermination campaigns. Their mastery of biological camouflage and dimensional manipulation could theoretically allow small populations to remain hidden even in regions that appear to have been completely sterilized. Several Inquisition reports from the 40th and 41st millennia describe encounters with beings whose capabilities and knowledge suggest possible Old One heritage, though such claims are treated with extreme skepticism by most imperial authorities due to the obvious implications for established theological doctrine. The species that emerged as inheritors of the galaxy following the Old One's disappearance bore little resemblance to the carefully guided civilizations that their creators had originally envisioned. The Krork, designed as the ultimate warrior race, underwent rapid evolutionary changes once freed from Old One oversight and psychic control. Without the stabilizing influence of their creators' genetic management, they began developing along paths that emphasized individual aggression and tribal competition rather than the coordinated military effectiveness they had been designed to provide. Their sophisticated biotechnology gradually degraded as successive generations lost the instinctive understanding of complex engineering principles that had been encoded in their original genetic template. The devolution of the Krork into the savage Orks that would plague the galaxy for the next 60 million years represents one of the most significant unintended consequences of Old One genetic engineering. The spore-based reproduction system that had been designed to provide rapid replacement of battlefield casualties became a mechanism for spreading increasingly primitive versions of the original species across countless worlds. Each new generation of Orks retained fewer of the advanced capabilities that their predecessors had possessed, though they maintained the fundamental aggression and technological instincts that made them formidable opponents despite their declining sophistication. The degradation process appears to have been accelerated by the loss of the psychic coordination networks that had allowed Krork forces to share knowledge and experience across their entire species. Without this collective intelligence system, individual Ork populations developed in isolation, adapting to local conditions in ways that gradually diverged from their original design parameters. The technological knowledge that had been encoded in their genetic memory became increasingly fragmented and corrupted, leading to the crude but effective engineering approaches that characterize modern Ork society. Despite this apparent devolution, certain Ork populations have occasionally demonstrated capabilities that suggest their original Krork heritage remains dormant rather than completely lost. During periods of extended warfare involving massive Ork populations, observers have reported the emergence of individual Orks whose size, intelligence, and technological sophistication approach the levels described in ancient records of Krork warriors. These exceptional individuals seem capable of organizing their lesser cousins into military formations that display tactical coordination and strategic thinking far beyond normal Ork capabilities, though such developments rarely persist beyond the lifetime of the extraordinary leaders who inspire them. The Eldar's inheritance of Old One psychic technologies proved both a blessing and a curse that would shape their development throughout the subsequent millions of years. Their creators had designed them with the intellectual flexibility and psychic sensitivity necessary to understand and improve upon Old One biotechnology, making them the most successful inheritors of the ancient knowledge that survived the war in heaven. Eldar craftworlds became repositories of biological engineering techniques that allowed them to maintain technological capabilities that rivaled their creators' achievements, though they lacked the vast temporal perspective and patient methodology that had characterized Old One science. The Eldar's relationship with the psychic realm proved more problematic than their creators had anticipated. Where the Old Ones had evolved natural safeguards against psychic corruption over millions of years, the Eldar possessed raw psychic power without equivalent protective mechanisms. Their enhanced emotional range and psychic sensitivity, originally designed to facilitate coordination with other warrior species, made them particularly vulnerable to the influence of chaos entities that continued to grow stronger in the aftermath of the war in heaven. The gradual corruption of Eldar society over the following millennia demonstrated the long-term consequences of creating psychically powerful species without adequate safeguards against warp influence. Their natural longevity and enhanced capabilities led to a civilization that gradually became obsessed with increasingly extreme experiences and sensations, unknowingly feeding the very chaos entities that their creators had struggled to contain. The eventual birth of Slaanesh through the collective psychic emanations of Eldar civilization represents perhaps the most catastrophic failure of Old One genetic engineering, creating a chaos god whose existence threatens every psychically active species in the galaxy. The technological legacy of the Old Ones proved more durable than their biological creations, with artifacts and installations surviving across the galaxy long after their creators' disappearance. These remnants demonstrate capabilities that exceed anything achieved by subsequent civilizations, operating through principles that combine biological engineering with psychic manipulation in ways that modern science cannot fully comprehend. Imperial techmarines who have studied Old One artifacts report technologies that seem to violate fundamental laws of physics, manipulating matter and energy through methods that appear to be based on conscious, rather than mechanical processes. The most significant Old One installations are the webway gates that provide rapid transit across galactic distances without the risks associated with conventional warp travel. These structures appear to be grown rather than built, their organic components interfacing seamlessly with crystalline matrices that can manipulate space-time to create stable tunnels through the Imperium. The gates demonstrate self-repair capabilities that have allowed them to function for millions of years without maintenance, though many have been damaged or destroyed by the reality storms that plague the modern warp. The webway itself represents the Old One's most enduring achievement, a galaxy-spanning transportation network that operates independently of the chaos-corrupted warp that makes conventional interdimensional travel so dangerous. The tunnels that comprise the webway appear to exist in a parallel dimension that remains partially isolated from the main Imperium, protected by barriers that prevent most forms of chaos incursion. This isolation has allowed the webway to remain functional even as the broader warp has become increasingly unstable, though sections of the network continue to fail as their ancient maintenance systems gradually break down. Archaeological evidence of Old One presence can be found on worlds throughout the galaxy, though much of it requires sophisticated detection equipment to identify due to the biological nature of their technology. Structures that appear to be natural geological formations often reveal themselves to be artificial constructs when subjected to detailed genetic analysis, their organic components having fossilized or evolved into forms that blend seamlessly with local ecosystems. These hidden installations sometimes retain limited functionality, responding to psychic stimuli or genetic triggers in ways that suggest their original programming remains partially active. The distribution of Old One ruins follows patterns that reflect their approach to galactic colonization, with major installations located at points where the boundary between real space and the Imperium was naturally thin. These nexus points provided optimal conditions for the interdimensional manipulation that characterized Old One technology, allowing them to establish facilities that could draw power directly from the warp while maintaining stable connections to normal space. Many of these locations have since become sites of significant psychic activity, attracting everything from chaos cults to Eldar shrines to Imperial psyker training facilities. Genetic analysis of various species across the galaxy has revealed evidence of Old One manipulation that extends far beyond their known client races. Subtle modifications to baseline genetic templates suggest that the Old Ones may have influenced the development of countless species through careful environmental manipulation and selective breeding programs that operated over geological timescales. These modifications often appear designed to enhance psychic potential or improve adaptation to specific environmental conditions, indicating that the Old Ones viewed the entire galaxy as a vast biological experiment rather than simply a collection of territories to be controlled. The influence of Old One genetic engineering can be detected in human populations, though the modifications appear to be relatively minor compared to those found in species like the Eldar or the remnants of other client races. Certain human bloodlines show genetic markers that suggest deliberate enhancement of psychic potential or resistance to environmental hazards, though these modifications may have been introduced indirectly through interbreeding with more heavily modified species rather than through direct Old One intervention. The navigator gene that allows certain humans to perceive warp currents bears particular similarities to modifications found in other species, suggesting a common origin in Old One biotechnology. The technological principles underlying Old One artifacts continue to influence the development of advanced technologies throughout the galaxy, though few civilizations possess the knowledge necessary to replicate their achievements directly. The Adeptus Mechanicus has identified several standard template construct designs that appear to be based on reverse-engineered Old One technologies, though the biological components that made the original systems so effective have been replaced with mechanical alternatives that provide only a fraction of the original capabilities. These hybrid technologies demonstrate the potential for combining Old One principles with conventional engineering, though such experiments often prove unstable or dangerous when attempted without proper understanding of the underlying biological processes. The psychic resonance patterns that characterize Old One installations have been detected in various locations across the galaxy, often in areas where no obvious ruins or artifacts are present. These resonance signatures suggest the presence of Old One influence that operates below the threshold of conventional detection, possibly through quantum-level modifications to local space-time that continue to affect the development of nearby ecosystems. Imperial psychers who have studied these phenomena report that the resonance patterns seem designed to encourage the development of psychically active species while providing protection against certain forms of chaos corruption. The preservation techniques employed by the Old Ones have proven remarkably effective at maintaining their genetic and technological legacy across millions of years. Crystalline storage matrices discovered in various ruins contain vast databases of biological information that remain accessible to beings with appropriate psychic capabilities, though the sheer volume of data makes comprehensive analysis impossible with current Imperial resources. These archives appear to contain the complete genetic templates for thousands of species, including many that have never been encountered in their living forms, suggesting that the Old Ones created far more client races than historical records indicate. The activation protocols for dormant Old One installations represent one of the greatest mysteries surrounding their legacy. Many ruins show signs of having been deliberately placed in stasis rather than simply abandoned, with their biological components maintained in suspended animation that could theoretically be reversed by appropriate stimuli. However, the specific triggers required to reactivate these systems remain unknown, as the Old Ones appear to have used psychic keys and genetic passwords that died with their creators. Attempts to activate dormant installations through conventional means have generally proven unsuccessful or dangerous, often resulting in uncontrolled biological growth that can threaten entire planetary ecosystems. The influence of Old One philosophy on subsequent galactic civilizations can be traced through various cultural and technological developments that emphasize biological adaptation over mechanical solutions. Species that evolved in regions with heavy Old One influence often demonstrate approaches to science and technology that prioritize working with natural processes rather than imposing artificial systems upon their environments. These civilizations tend to develop biotechnologies that, while less sophisticated than their Old One predecessors, reflect similar principles of symbiotic relationship between consciousness and biological systems. The long-term consequences of Old One genetic engineering continue to manifest in unexpected ways throughout the galaxy. Species that appear to have no direct connection to Old One client races sometimes exhibit capabilities or characteristics that can only be explained through ancient genetic modifications that have been passed down through millions of years of evolution. These inherited traits often remain dormant until triggered by specific environmental conditions or genetic combinations, suggesting that the Old Ones embedded safeguards and contingencies in their creations that could activate long after their own disappearance. The influence of the Old Ones permeates the 41st millennium in ways that most inhabitants of the galaxy cannot comprehend, their ancient legacy manifesting through technologies, species, and cosmic phenomena that continue to shape the fate of countless worlds. For the Eldar, the memory of their creators remains a fundamental aspect of their cultural identity, woven into their mythology as the foundation myth that explains both their greatness and their eternal struggle against extinction. Eldar farseers speak of the Old Ones not as distant historical figures, but as the eternal shapers whose wisdom continues to guide their species through the darkest periods of galactic history. The Eldar understanding of Old One legacy differs significantly from the fragmentary records available to other species. Their racial memory, enhanced by psychic abilities that allow them to access ancestral experiences directly, preserves detailed knowledge of Old One biotechnology and philosophy that has been lost to conventional historical analysis. Craftworld libraries contain wraithbone constructs that store the complete genetic templates of dozens of Old One client species, along with theoretical frameworks for biological engineering that exceed anything achieved by subsequent civilizations. These archives reveal that the Old Ones viewed consciousness itself as a form of biological technology that could be cultivated and enhanced through careful manipulation of psychic resonance patterns. Eldar mythology describes the Old Ones as beings who existed in perfect harmony with the natural flow of time and space, capable of perceiving the threads of fate that connect all living things across the galaxy. This perspective influences every aspect of Eldar society, from their approach to warfare to their methods of technological development. Eldar seers use divination techniques that they claim were taught directly by Old One mentors, reading the patterns of future probability through methods that combine psychic perception with genetic analysis of biological systems. Their ability to predict enemy movements and identify optimal strategic responses derives from Old One knowledge of how consciousness interacts with the fundamental forces that govern reality. The path system that structures Eldar society represents their attempt to apply Old One wisdom to the challenge of avoiding chaos corruption while maintaining their psychic abilities. Each path provides a framework for channeling emotional and psychic energy in ways that prevent the dangerous accumulations that led to Slaanesh's birth. Eldar philosophers argue that this system reflects Old One understanding of how consciousness must be carefully managed to prevent it from becoming a weapon in enemy hands. The discipline required to master each path mirrors the patient, methodical approach that characterized Old One biological engineering, emphasizing gradual development over rapid advancement. The Imperium's knowledge of the war in heaven remains fragmentary and often contradictory, filtered through millennia of imperial propaganda and theological interpretation that has obscured the true nature of the conflict. Imperial scholars possess sufficient archaeological evidence to confirm that a massive galactic war occurred millions of years before humanity's emergence, but the specific details of the combatants and their motivations have been lost or deliberately suppressed. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintains classified archives containing Old One artifacts and Necron technology, but access to these materials is restricted to the highest levels of the tech priest hierarchy due to concerns about technological heresy and chaos corruption. Imperial understanding of Old One capabilities has been shaped primarily by encounters with their surviving technologies rather than direct historical records. Tech Marines who have studied Old One installations report devices that operate through principles completely alien to conventional Imperial science, manipulating biological and psychic forces in ways that seem to violate the fundamental laws of physics. These observations have led to theological debates within the Adeptus Mechanicus about whether Old One technology represents legitimate scientific achievement or dangerous sorcery that should be destroyed rather than studied. The discovery of intact Old One genetic archives has provided Imperial researchers with tantalizing glimpses of the biological engineering techniques that created species like the Eldar and the Orks. However, attempts to replicate these techniques have generally ended in failure or catastrophe, as Imperial science lacks the psychic sensitivity and temporal perspective necessary to safely manipulate consciousness at the genetic level. Several classified incidents involve Imperial research teams that attempted to activate dormant Old One installations, resulting in uncontrolled biological growth that consumed entire research facilities and required exterminatus protocols to contain. The Space Marines represent humanity's most successful attempt to apply Old One principles to genetic enhancement, though the Emperor's techniques differed significantly from those employed by the ancient masters. Where Old One biotechnology emphasized symbiotic relationships between consciousness and biological systems, the Space Marine creation process relies on mechanical implants and chemical conditioning that impose artificial enhancements upon baseline human physiology. The results demonstrate both the potential and the limitations of attempting to replicate Old One achievements without understanding their underlying principles. Imperial military doctrine has been influenced by fragmentary knowledge of Old One warrior species, particularly in the development of specialized units designed to counter specific Xenos threats. The Death Watch maintains extensive files on Ork behavior patterns that reflect their degraded Krork heritage, using this knowledge to predict enemy tactics and identify vulnerabilities in Ork technology. Similarly, Imperial forces fighting against Eldar opponents have learned to anticipate the psychic coordination and strategic flexibility that characterizes their enemies' approach to warfare, though countering these advantages remains extremely difficult without equivalent psychic capabilities. The connection between Old One legacy and current galactic threats becomes most apparent in the ongoing struggle against chaos corruption. The warp storms that plague the 41st millennium represent the direct continuation of the psychic disturbances that began during the War in Heaven, amplified by 60 million years of warfare and suffering that have fed the Chaos Gods with unprecedented amounts of emotional energy. Imperial psychers who venture into heavily corrupted regions report encountering psychic echoes of ancient battles, suggesting that the trauma of the War in Heaven continues to reverberate through the Imperium in ways that make chaos incursions more likely and more dangerous. The Emperor's development of the Webway project demonstrates humanity's recognition that Old One transportation technology offers the only viable alternative to conventional warp travel in an era when the Imperium has become increasingly hostile to biological life. Imperial archives contain fragmentary technical specifications for Webway construction that appear to be based on reverse-engineered Old One designs, though the biological components that made the original system so effective have been replaced with mechanical alternatives that provide only limited functionality. The failure of the Webway project following the Horus Heresy represents not only a strategic disaster for humanity, but also the loss of the best opportunity to escape dependence on chaos-corrupted warp travel. The awakening Necron dynasties pose a threat that directly connects the 41st millennium to the ancient War in Heaven, as these artificial beings retain both the technological capabilities and the strategic objectives that drove their original campaign against biological life. Necron forces emerging from their tomb worlds demonstrate weapons and tactics that were specifically designed to counter Old One biotechnology, making them particularly effective against Imperial forces that rely on biological enhancement and psychic coordination. The systematic nature of Necron expansion suggests that they are following predetermined protocols established millions of years ago, treating the current galactic situation as a continuation of their ancient war rather than a new conflict. The Khatan shards that occasionally manifest during Necron campaigns represent fragments of the star gods who orchestrated the original biotransference process, their consciousness fragmented, but their fundamental hostility to biological life unchanged. These entities possess knowledge of Old One weaknesses that they exploited during the war in Heaven, making them uniquely dangerous to species that have inherited Old One genetic modifications. Imperial forces that encounter Khatan shards report weapons, effects that seem designed specifically to disrupt biological processes and psychic abilities, suggesting that these ancient beings retain detailed knowledge of how to counter the advantages that Old One engineering provided to their client species. The possibility that hidden Old One enclaves or descendants might still exist in the dark corners of the galaxy represents one of the most intriguing mysteries of the 41st millennium. Several Inquisition reports describe encounters with beings whose capabilities and knowledge suggest possible Old One heritage, though such claims are treated with extreme skepticism due to their obvious implications for established Imperial doctrine. These alleged encounters typically occur in regions of space where reality itself seems unstable, suggesting that any surviving Old One populations might exist in dimensional pockets or parallel realities that remain partially isolated from normal space-time. The most credible reports of Old One survivors come from rogue trader expeditions that have ventured into the galactic halo regions beyond the reach of conventional Imperial exploration. These distant areas contain star systems that show signs of large-scale biological engineering projects that bear similarities to known Old One techniques, though the vast distances involved make direct investigation impossible with current Imperial resources. Long-range astronomical observations have identified several systems where entire planets appear to be artificial constructs grown rather than built, their organic surfaces pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that suggest ongoing biological activity. Alternative theories propose that Old One consciousness might survive in forms that no longer require physical bodies, existing as pure psychic entities within specially constructed pocket dimensions, or as distributed intelligences that inhabit the quantum structure of space-time itself. This possibility is supported by reports from Imperial psychers who claim to have encountered alien minds of vast age and knowledge during deep meditative states, though such experiences are often dismissed as chaos-induced hallucinations rather than genuine contact with ancient beings. The Tau Empire's rapid technological development and sophisticated understanding of biological systems has led some Imperial xenobiologists to speculate about possible Old One influence in their evolution. The Tau's ability to integrate multiple species into their expanding empire through methods that emphasize cooperation rather than conquest mirrors Old One approaches to galactic colonization, though this similarity might represent convergent evolution rather than direct inheritance. More intriguingly, Tau biotechnology demonstrates capabilities that seem to exceed what their relatively recent emergence as a spacefaring species should have allowed, suggesting either hidden knowledge sources or guidance from beings with more advanced understanding of biological engineering. The Tyranid hive fleets represent a threat that operates according to principles similar to those employed by Old One warrior species, using biological adaptation and psychic coordination to overcome technological disadvantages. Some Imperial theorists have proposed that the Tyranids might represent a perverted evolution of Old One biotechnology, possibly created by surviving Old One populations as a weapon against the species that inherited their galaxy. This theory is supported by the Tyranids' apparent immunity to many forms of chaos corruption and their systematic approach to consuming biological matter while leaving mineral resources largely untouched, suggesting strategic objectives that go beyond simple survival instincts. The emergence of new psychic phenomena throughout the galaxy continues to reflect the long-term consequences of Old One genetic engineering. Human populations in regions with heavy Old One influence often demonstrate higher rates of psychic mutation and enhanced resistance to certain forms of chaos corruption, suggesting that ancient genetic modifications continue to manifest in unexpected ways. These inherited traits often remain dormant until triggered by specific environmental conditions or genetic combinations, indicating that the Old Ones embedded safeguards and contingencies in their creations that could activate millions of years after their own disappearance. The ongoing degradation of the webway network represents one of the most significant challenges facing species that depend on Old One technology for survival. Eldar craftworlds report increasing numbers of webway routes becoming unstable or completely inaccessible as the ancient maintenance systems gradually fail without their creators' oversight. The Dark Eldar's desperate raids into real space partly reflect their need to acquire resources necessary to maintain their portion of the webway, as their Camorra stronghold depends entirely on Old One transportation technology for its continued existence. The study of Old One ruins continues to yield discoveries that revolutionize Imperial understanding of advanced biotechnology, though such research must be conducted with extreme caution due to the risks of accidental activation or chaos corruption. Several Forge worlds maintain specialized research facilities dedicated to analyzing Old One artifacts, using heavily shielded laboratories and multiple redundant containment systems to prevent dangerous biological agents from escaping into the broader environment. These facilities have produced technological innovations that enhance Imperial military capabilities, though the underlying principles remain largely incomprehensible to conventional Imperial science. The legacy of the Old Ones serves as both inspiration and warning for the species that inherited their galaxy. Their achievements demonstrate the potential for consciousness and biological engineering to reshape reality itself, creating technologies and life forms that transcend the limitations of conventional physics. However, their ultimate fate illustrates the dangers of pursuing such power without adequate safeguards against the forces that consciousness itself can unleash. The chaos gods that emerged from the psychic energy generated during the war in heaven continue to threaten every psychically active species in the galaxy, representing a permanent reminder of the price that the Old Ones paid for their ambitious attempts to guide galactic evolution. As the 41st millennium draws toward its close, the echoes of the war in heaven continue to reverberate through every aspect of galactic civilization. The technologies that enable faster-than-light travel, the genetic modifications that create superhuman warriors, and the psychic abilities that allow communication across vast distances all trace their origins to Old One innovations developed millions of years ago. Yet these same capabilities carry within them the seeds of corruption and destruction that brought down their creators, ensuring that the ancient struggle between order and chaos, creation and entropy, consciousness and oblivion, remains as relevant today as it was when the first warp storms began to tear through the fabric of reality itself. The Old Ones may have vanished from the galaxy, but their greatest creation endures, not in any single species or technology, but in the fundamental principle that consciousness itself represents the universe's highest achievement and greatest threat. Every psychic awakening, every act of biological engineering, and every attempt to transcend the limitations of physical existence carries forward their legacy, ensuring that their influence will continue to shape galactic destiny until the very stars burn cold and the last conscious being draws its final breath. In this sense, the war in heaven never truly ended. It simply transformed into the eternal struggle that defines existence in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, and the echoes of ancient gods continue to whisper in the dreams of their distant children.